This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I first learned about the hidden chalet while studying a hiking map of Shawnee National Forest. I noticed a small mark labeled "Abandoned Cabin" near one of the more remote trails. The notation intrigued me because I'd never heard of a residential structure in that specific area. I was used to campgrounds, old ranger stations, or historical cabins that visitors sometimes talked about. But this one seemed different, as if it had been erased from most guides. I decided I had to see it for myself. I packed my gear on a clear morning, drove out to the forest, and parked by a small gravel turnout near the trailhead. The forest path was quiet. I heard only the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. The morning sun filtered through thick branches overhead. It was spring, so the air felt cool, but I could see fresh greenery all around. As I hiked deeper, I realized the temperature seemed to drop even more. I thought maybe it was due to the dense canopy blocking out direct sunlight. After about an hour, I found a faint side trail that barely looked used. Broken branches and vines covered much of it. I followed it with difficulty, pushing through some undergrowth. Eventually, I caught my first glimpse of the chalet. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall old trees. Vines and moss clung to the exterior walls. The structure appeared solid despite the obvious neglect. The wood was dark and weathered, and I saw no signs of recent upkeep. A slight breeze moved the vines hanging over the windows. The place looked sealed, but the front door was closed only by a simple latch. I didn't see any locks or chains. I felt a chill that made me hesitate. Still, curiosity drove me forward. I approached the door, noticing the handle had rust on it. I tested it gently. It shifted with a creak and opened into a dim interior. The smell of dust and old wood flooded out. I walked in, shining the small flashlight I keep in my backpack. Inside, the front room was sparse. There were a couple of wooden chairs, both overturned. Shelves along the wall were empty, save for a few cobwebs. I noticed deep scratch marks on the chairs and on one of the shelves, like someone had dragged sharp nails across them in frustration or fear. The air felt stale, even though outside it was a cool spring morning. I scanned the floor and saw footprints in the thin layer of dust. They looked old. It was hard to tell how many sets there were, but it looked like one adult set at least. I stepped carefully, not wanting to stir up more dust than necessary. In a corner near the fireplace, I spotted a small, tattered book on the ground. I picked it up, brushing off the dirt. It was a diary of sorts. The cover was worn, and the first few pages were barely legible. But as I flipped through, I could make out entries describing loud noises at night, things like footsteps circling the cabin, knocks on the walls, and scratching sounds. One entry ended mid-sentence, which sent a small jolt of alarm through me. It was as though the writer got interrupted while describing something urgent. I heard a soft creak from upstairs at that moment. The sound was quick, like a single step on an old plank. I froze. My breath stuck in my throat. I considered calling out, but I worried about who or what I'd find. Still, I had come here intending to explore, and I was determined not to run at the first strange noise. I tucked the diary under my arm and walked toward the wooden staircase that led to the second floor. Each step groaned under my weight. The closer I got to the top, the more uneasy I felt. My flashlight beam shook slightly because my hand had started trembling. Upstairs, I found a narrow hallway with 2 doors on opposite sides. The door on the left hung ajar, while the one on the right was closed. I peered into the left room first. It was a small bedroom with a bed frame but no mattress. A large window stood open, letting in a draft. I immediately noticed dark, muddy footprints on the floor. They seemed fresh, which made no sense because the dust layer elsewhere suggested no one had visited in a while. My pulse kicked up a notch. The prints led straight to the open window. I stepped closer, feeling goosebumps on my arms. A sudden gust of wind slammed the window shut with a loud bang, nearly hitting my fingers. The force sent a flurry of dust into the air, and I stumbled backward. My heart pounded, and my eyes watered from the dust. I gripped the edge of a small table to steady myself. Once the air cleared, I noticed how cold the room felt. I'd been in open windows before, but something about that gust felt unnatural. My stomach twisted with a surge of fear. I turned quickly to leave the bedroom. The diary under my arm shifted, almost slipping from my grasp. I walked back into the hallway, intending to check the second door briefly before heading back downstairs. Just as I reached for the doorknob, I heard a muffled laugh. It was soft and high-pitched, like a child. The sound came from behind me, where the stairs were. My body tensed. A wave of panic shot through my veins. I glanced over my shoulder, shining my flashlight into the hallway. Empty. No one stood there. But the laughter echoed in my ears for a moment longer, then faded. My thoughts scrambled. I felt an urge to run, but also a stubborn need to confirm if anyone was actually in this building. I moved toward the second door, but my hand shook too much to grip the knob. In that split second, I heard a soft thumping noise from downstairs, like something heavy dropping onto the floor. That was it for me. My mind screamed that I was no longer alone in this chalet, and that staying meant risking more than just a scare. I tore down the stairs as fast as I could. Back on the main level, I scanned the area, but I saw nothing and no one. I hurried toward the front door. My boots kicked up dust, stirring the musty smell. I yanked the door open, almost stumbling over the threshold. Once I got outside, I felt a rush of cool forest air against my face. I took several quick steps away from the entrance. Then, in a burst of paranoia, I turned around to look at the chalet. I wanted to see if anyone followed me out. My throat tightened at what I spotted. Something crouched on the roof, near the chimney. It looked like a hunched figure, dark in outline against the forest backdrop. I couldn't make out details, but it seemed to move in a quick, jerky way. My chest constricted. I gasped, stepping back even more. The figure slid behind the chimney and vanished. I stood there, adrenaline rushing, unsure if I should investigate or flee. I decided not to stick around. Clutching the diary, I turned and made my way back through the overgrown trail as quickly as I could, nearly tripping over roots and stones in my haste. By the time I reached the main path, my legs ached and my breathing was ragged. I glanced back over my shoulder repeatedly, but I saw no one. The forest was eerily still. Every small sound made me jump. I felt like I was being watched from the treetops or from behind thick trunks. After about an hour of fast-paced hiking, I emerged onto the gravel turnout where my car was parked. I threw my gear in the back and locked the doors once I was inside. My hands shook as I tried to start the engine. It roared to life, and I sped away from that place without looking back. That evening, when I got home, I forced myself to open the diary again under the bright light of my kitchen. The entries ranged from casual notes about the weather to more unsettling reports of strange sounds at night. The last few pages spoke of hearing voices outside, footsteps circling the chalet, and a persistent scratching at the windows. The final sentence mentioned seeing a shape on the roof. Then it ended. No signature, no date, no explanation. I searched online for any mention of a missing family in that part of Shawnee National Forest. I found scattered references to a couple and their 2 children who vanished some years ago. Official records pointed to possible animal attacks or them getting lost in the woods. But local rumors hinted that the family might have encountered something unnatural in the forest. Speculation ran wild, and nobody seemed to have concrete proof. Yet it all matched the story in the diary and what I experienced. The footprints, the laughter, the figure on the roof. I couldn't dismiss it as a coincidence. In the days that followed, I had nightmares about that place. I dreamed I was standing in the upstairs bedroom, hearing the window slam again and again. In the dream, I'd see footprints lead to the window, but when I turned around, the footprints turned into claw marks. Each time, I woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, with the diary lying on my nightstand. I considered throwing it away, but I kept it as a reminder of what I witnessed. I told a few friends about my ordeal. Some believed me outright, saying the Shawnee National Forest has a lot of hidden history. Others gave me skeptical looks, suggesting my imagination filled in the gaps after exploring a creepy old cabin. But I know the difference between a quiet, abandoned property and what I felt there. The sense of being watched and the cold blast from that window were too real. The laughter, soft, childlike, still haunts me. I haven't returned to that section of the forest. I still enjoy hiking, but I stick to well-traveled trails. Sometimes I'll hear people mention that old chalet, usually in hushed tones, passing along rumors about missing hikers or unusual sightings. I don't jump in to tell them my story unless they ask. If they do ask, I give them the facts. The cabin is still there, vine-covered, with scratch marks on the furniture, a diary describing unexplained events, and footprints that don't make sense. I also warn them that something might be watching from the roof. Most of them dismiss it, but a few decide not to go. I can't blame them. In the end, I kept the diary locked away in a drawer, uncertain what to do with it. Some nights, I consider sending it to the authorities or a local historical group. Then I remember the figure I saw on the roof and that faint laugh in the corridor. I wonder if it matters who sees the diary. The place itself still stands, and whatever is out there is still roaming those trees. That's enough to keep me away. I don't need any more evidence. The memory of that cold, dusty chalet and the sight of that thing on the roof is all the proof I need that I shouldn't return. When people ask, I just say it's not safe, and that's the truth I can live with. I decided to install a small camera on my dashboard because I'd heard too many stories about strange sightings along Route 54 in Kansas. The road always looked peaceful in daytime, just long stretches of asphalt cutting through endless fields. But I'd come across local rumors about shadows appearing at night, almost like figures drifting onto the highway. I'm not a fan of ghost stories, but I kept hearing them, and I wanted proof. If I saw nothing, at least I'd have a normal video of an empty road. I left work one evening later than usual. By the time I got on Route 54, the sun had already set. The sky still had that faint orange band on the horizon, but darkness was taking over fast. I set up the camera, made sure it was recording, and drove east. At first, I could only hear the hum of my engine and the low static of the radio. The signal in that area was never good, so the radio station kept fading in and out. I tried scanning for stations, but all I got was more static. The asphalt ahead stretched out in a straight line. My headlights lit up the lane stripes and small reflective markers along the shoulders. Every now and then, The beams caught glimpses of the tall wheat fields to my left and right. There were no other cars in sight. It felt like I was the only one on the road for miles. I noticed the temperature gauge on my dashboard was normal, but I felt a chill in the air seeping through the vents. I double-checked the heater controls. Everything was set correctly, yet it felt colder than usual. About 10 minutes into the drive, my headlights revealed a dark shape on the shoulder, like a figure standing there. I slowed down out of concern. As I approached, the shape seemed to dissolve into nothing. My heart gave a quick jolt. I blinked, wondering if it was a trick of the light. I pulled to the side of the road briefly, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing there. I could feel my pulse thumping, though. I glanced at the camera to make sure it was still rolling. The red light on the device blinked, indicating it was recording. I thought I might have caught the shape on film, so I felt a mixture of excitement and dread. I got back on the road. A few miles later, I felt my hands sweating on the steering wheel. I kept my eyes forward, expecting more strange shapes to appear. The fields looked calm, only moving in the light breeze. Then the radio crackled, and I heard a burst of static. The lights on my dashboard flickered for a second, like the electrical system was losing power. My stomach clenched. I tapped the brake just to see if everything else was working. The car slowed, but the engine stayed on. The flickering stopped, and the radio returned to static. I exhaled, telling myself it was probably some minor glitch. All at once, a dark figure darted into the road, right at the edge of my headlights. It was a silhouette, shaped like a person but pitch black. I slammed on the brakes. My tires screeched and the car jerked forward. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I expected to hit something. Instead, the figure vanished. I yelled, "Oh my God!" and looked around frantically. No one was there. The road was empty. My breathing came fast, and I glanced at the camera. It was still recording, so maybe I had evidence of that shape. I forced myself to keep driving. I pressed the gas pedal, my nerves on edge. I could barely keep my eyes on the speedometer because I was too focused on the road ahead. I noticed I was gripping the wheel tightly. My arms felt tense. The static on the radio got louder. I tried to switch it off, but the button seemed unresponsive. Finally, I managed to power it down, and the cabin fell silent except for the hum of the engine. A few minutes later, I spotted multiple shadows in the distance. It was as if several dark forms were running alongside the fields, parallel to my car. They didn't move in a natural way. Their motion was too smooth, almost gliding just beyond the edges of my headlights. My mouth went dry, and I forced myself to keep steady. I watched them in my peripheral vision. My heart thumped against my ribs. I glanced at the camera again, hoping it was catching everything. The memory of past stories came rushing back. People said these shadows sometimes chased cars, appearing and disappearing without warning. Then, one of those shapes crossed the road directly in front of me. It was fast, and I couldn't make out any facial features or clothing. It was just a solid black form. My foot slammed on the brake. The car lurched, and I nearly lost control. My seatbelt dug into my shoulder as I jerked forward. I let out a small scream. When the car stopped, the shape was gone. Only the empty highway stretched out under my headlights. I felt a wave of panic flood my body. My eyes started tearing up, partly from fear, partly from adrenaline. My throat felt constricted. After a few seconds, I pressed the gas again, accelerating way past the speed limit. My hands shook on the wheel. I had to remind myself to breathe. The dark fields outside looked endless, and every time I scanned them, I thought I saw flickers of movement. More silhouettes streaking across the road or drifting along the shoulder. My stomach churned. I considered turning around, but going back meant retracing my steps through the same eerie spots. I decided to keep going forward until I reached the nearest gas station or rest stop. My car began to sputter. The dashboard lights flickered again. The engine lost power for a second, then roared back. I panicked, imagining myself stranded on that road. I pressed the accelerator. The car responded enough to keep moving, but I heard a faint knocking sound from the engine. My nerves were already shot. My mouth was dry, and my heart wouldn't slow down. Then I saw something that made my skin crawl. A group of shadows on the right side, moving in tandem with my car. They seemed to match my speed, flowing across the wheat fields. I couldn't hear anything from them, but I felt a pounding in my ears. I felt trapped in some kind of nightmare. I pushed the pedal harder. The speedometer climbed, but the shadows kept pace. Occasionally, one would veer in front of me, then vanish before my eyes. I let out short gasps, barely holding back panicked sobs. My muscles ached from the tension. The road felt endless. I kept telling myself I'd see a sign or some lights soon. My eyes darted at the camera, desperate to confirm it was still capturing this. The little blinking red dot was there, but I had no idea if it was picking up the silhouettes. When I finally saw a dimly lit gas station in the distance, I almost cried with relief. I sped toward it, ignoring the possibility of a speeding ticket. As I approached, I noticed the station's lights flickering. A single pump island stood under a buzzing overhead lamp. I pulled in fast, braking harder than I should have. My car jerked to a stop. I looked around, scanning the dark fields. The silhouettes seemed gone. The air felt heavy, but I didn't see any more movement. I switched off the engine, and for a moment, I just sat there, breathing hard. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. My mind replayed every shadowy figure I'd seen. My eyes darted to the camera. I removed it from the dashboard and checked if it was still running. It showed a steady red light, so I stopped the recording. Then I replayed a few seconds of footage. I saw mostly darkness, with my headlights lighting the road. I could make out faint flickers at the edges of the screen. It wasn't clear, but there were definitely shapes there. My heart raced again, confirming it wasn't just my imagination. I needed a moment to calm down, so I went inside the station's little shop. The bright fluorescent lights made me squint. The attendant behind the counter saw my face and asked if I was okay. I could hear my own voice shaking as I explained I almost hit something on the road. I didn't mention the shadows. He nodded sympathetically and said there had been many accidents on that stretch, with people swerving to avoid things. He didn't elaborate. He just said it in a flat, matter-of-fact way. My stomach tightened again, but I also felt validated. After I got some water and tried to steady my nerves, I stepped outside. The station lights buzzed. The surrounding darkness pressed in from every direction. I made myself check the camera footage more thoroughly. I saw shadows on the edges of the screen, just like I remembered, but they were blurry. Sometimes they resembled human silhouettes, sometimes just dark smudges. None of them were in clear focus. I felt a weird combination of relief and frustration. I had proof, yet it wasn't sharp or obvious. I decided to stay in the station's parking lot for a while, waiting for my heart to stop racing. Eventually, I texted a friend, telling him about the weird night. He told me he'd heard the same stories. Wandering shadows on Route 54. I felt a little less crazy, but it didn't make me feel safer. I stayed there until I built up the courage to get back on the road. It was late, but I couldn't stay at the station all night. When I drove off again, I kept my speed moderate, and I tried not to look for shadows. I stayed alert, scanning the fields, but nothing else appeared. The rest of the trip was uneventful. though I was tense the entire time. By the time I reached home, the sky was almost starting to lighten. I parked, went inside, and sat on my couch. My hands were still unsteady, and my eyes felt itchy from strain. I replayed the footage on my laptop. In slow motion, I could see fleeting shapes crossing in front of the headlights. They looked like black masses that faded in and out of view. It made my skin crawl all over again. I haven't driven that stretch of Route 54 at night since then. I make sure to travel during daylight or find an alternate route. Some people say the shadows come from spirits of travelers who died in accidents. Others talk about natural illusions created by the darkness and the wind in the wheat fields. I'm not sure what I believe anymore. All I know is I saw enough to convince me that it's not normal. Whenever someone asks about it, I show them the fuzzy dashcam clips. Most of them get spooked and admit it's strange, but they can't quite tell what they're seeing. Some blame it on camera glitches or headlights reflecting on the fields. I don't argue. I just explain how real it felt at the time and how terrified I was. I still remember my pounding heart, the flickering lights, and the sense that something was racing alongside me in the dark. That's enough for me. I don't need more proof. I lived through that one intense drive, and it left me uneasy about traveling alone at night on that empty Kansas highway. Now, I warn people when they mention Route 54. I tell them it might look peaceful, but once the sun goes down, strange things can happen. Some folks shrug it off, but a few look worried and ask for details. I don't embellish anything. I describe exactly what I experienced. The shapes, the flickering radio, the car losing power, and the overwhelming fear that came from not understanding what I was seeing. If they still want to drive that route at night, that's their choice. I'm done tempting fate. I've seen more than enough to convince me that something odd lingers out there in those silent Kansas fields. I got my first real lead for a journalistic piece when I heard rumors about a sealed building on campus. The place was a stone structure with heavy wooden doors, cordoned off by old boards and a rusty chain. People said it used to be some sort of secret library for occult studies, but it closed after a tragedy that no one wanted to discuss. I felt the need to investigate. I was a student journalist, and I believed this could be my breakthrough story. I managed to convince a campus staff member to grant me temporary access under the condition that I take full responsibility for my own safety. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was going down, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The building loomed behind a section of overgrown shrubs. Its windows were tall and covered with dusty curtains on the inside. The door had a thick padlock, but the staff member had given me a key. My heart pounded as I turned the key and heard the click of the lock. I pushed the door open, and a smell of stale air and old paper hit me. Inside, it was dark. I switched on my flashlight and panned it around. I saw rows of tall shelves stuffed with books. Every shelf was covered in dust. A few large wooden desks stood in the middle of the room, each with chairs pushed haphazardly aside. I noticed melted candles on some desks, their wax frozen in mid-drip. There was an unsettling quiet. My ears strained to pick up any small sound. I could hear my own breathing, and I realized I was gripping my flashlight too hard. I stepped forward slowly. Each footstep stirred a bit of dust off the floor. My pulse quickened. I felt like I was stepping into a place untouched by time. I shone the light across the shelves. The book titles were in different languages, Latin, Greek, and some I couldn't identify. Some spines had strange symbols, others had no visible text at all. As I moved deeper, I noticed a set of heavy stone pillars near the back, framing an open space that housed more shelves. The ceiling here was high, and I saw a skylight, but it was covered by something on the outside, blocking most of the evening light. Only a small glow came through, leaving the area dim. I paused to get my bearings. The temperature felt lower as I walked in. My skin prickled from the chill in the air. I approached a table that held a few open manuscripts. Their pages had intricate drawings of circles and shapes that resembled astrological charts. I brushed away some dust and realized the text was in a language I couldn't read. My breath caught when I noticed faint stains on one page, possibly wax or something else. I glanced around, wondering if someone had been studying these pages before the library was sealed. The silence became more oppressive. My flashlight flickered for a second, and I tapped it nervously. I thought about turning back, but my curiosity pushed me onward. I spotted a smaller room off to the left, separated from the main area by a glass door that was propped open. Stepping through, I found more shelves full of books about alchemy, demonology, and various esoteric practices. I saw a narrow corridor at the back that seemed to lead to a storage area. My heartbeat thumped in my ears as I advanced. The corridor smelled of dampness, and the floor felt uneven. I tried to be careful with each step. Suddenly, I heard a faint rustling, like a draft pushing papers around. I aimed my flashlight in every direction, but I saw no movement. My stomach tightened. I took a breath and forced myself to continue. The corridor opened into a small alcove with a massive wooden desk. Papers were scattered across it, as if someone left in a hurry. I aimed my light and noticed diagrams of large symbols drawn on parchment. Some had partial translations in English, referencing ancient rituals tied to planetary alignments. My mind raced with questions. Who had been working here? Why was it all left in disarray? A sudden gust of cold air swept through the space, making my hair stand on end. I looked around for a window, but everything was boarded. A low creaking sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the building, followed by what felt like a mild tremor under my feet. I froze, one hand braced on the desk. The quivering stopped almost as soon as it began. My heart pounded in my chest, and I realized my palms were damp with sweat. I retraced my steps, moving back toward the main library area. My eyes scanned the shelves, half expecting to see someone or something peering at me from between the rows of books. The sense of being watched began to gnaw at me. I paused to gather my thoughts. I told myself to stay calm, that it was just an old building with structural issues. Yet my skin tingled with apprehension. Back in the center of the library, I aimed my flashlight upward. I saw the large skylight overhead, which let in a dull beam of twilight. Beneath it lay a grand symbol on the floor, drawn with some kind of paint or chalk. It looked like a circle with geometric shapes around it. The edges of the circle had scorch marks, as if candles or fires had been placed there. I walked closer. The boards under my feet creaked. My throat felt tight, and my breathing grew shallow. I glanced around and noticed broken candle stubs scattered along the perimeter of the circle. Some had left small charred spots on the floor. A quick mental image of students or professors performing strange experiments here flashed in my mind. I kneeled down to look at the markings more closely. They were intricate and precise, not random scribbles. My shoulders tensed as I considered what might have happened in this spot. At that moment, I caught a faint, low whisper near my ear. I spun around, sweeping my flashlight across the shelves. Nothing. My chest tightened. I rubbed the back of my neck, trying to calm myself. I heard the whisper again, but this time it felt like it came from inside my head. My pulse raced, and I staggered back, nearly stumbling into a desk. I clenched my jaw, alarmed by the intensity of the sensation. The overhead skylight dimmed further, as though something passed above it. The library grew darker, and the shadows around the shelves stretched across the floor. My flashlight beam flickered again. I told myself to remain steady. I turned to leave, but the door at the entrance stood far away, and a wave of fear swept over me. For a moment, I thought the building was shifting around me, or that the shadows were moving on their own. It was as if the library wanted me to stay. I forced my feet to move. I headed for the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, and I couldn't stop imagining someone right behind me. My ears seemed to pick up faint groans coming from the walls. When I reached the exit, I found it shut, even though I'd left it ajar. My breath caught in my throat. I placed a hand on the handle and pushed. It gave way but felt heavier than before. I opened it just enough to slip out. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me with a dull thud. I jumped at the sound. Outside, the sky had turned a deep blue. I realized I was shaking. My pulse was still high, and my hands fumbled with the chain and padlock. I locked the place up and stepped back. The building looked silent, and I couldn't see any lights or movement through the windows. It took a few seconds before I caught my breath properly. I walked away, not looking back until I was halfway across the courtyard. I only glanced over my shoulder once. Everything remained still. The next day I went to the administration and told them everything. They listened politely, but they had blank faces. One person said it was just an old archived library that had been closed for safety reasons. No one wanted to talk about the rumored tragedies. They all either changed the subject or suggested I let it go. I insisted they should at least check the structural integrity or the old candle remains. They nodded but gave no further comment. I spoke to a few other students, but most had heard only fragments of the story. That something dark happened there decades ago, something involving a ritual that went out of control. Supposedly, a few students disappeared or were taken to a hospital with unexplained injuries. No one had official records. It was all secondhand. Still, it matched the unsettling atmosphere I experienced. I tried to do more research. I visited the local library outside campus, hoping to find newspaper clippings or archived materials. I found very little. A single paragraph in an old campus newsletter mentioned unusual activity and building closure, but no one had ever published specifics. It seemed the college buried the story. I felt blocked at every turn, like the staff wanted the events forgotten. I began having vivid nightmares. I'd see that enormous symbol on the floor, lit by flickering candles. I'd hear voices chanting in an unfamiliar language. I'd bolt awake, covered in sweat, feeling as though something was watching me from the corner of my room. I tried to push these thoughts away, but the more I tried, the more they haunted me. After a few weeks, I decided to back off. I realized I was messing with forces I didn't fully understand. I told myself to focus on other articles, but sometimes, while walking across campus at night, I'd sense a chill breeze and think about that locked stone building. Even during the day, I could see its outline from certain spots near the quad. I never went near it again. Now, when I talk about my experience, people react differently. Some are curious, wanting me to elaborate on the eerie atmosphere and the old manuscripts. Others dismiss it as an overactive imagination. I can't deny what I felt. The sudden drop in temperature, the flickering flashlight, and the heavy silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I remember the trembling floor, the strange diagrams, and the sense that something lingered in the shadows, watching. I still have the notes and a few photos I managed to snap before everything got too overwhelming. When I look at them, I notice the library's interior looks ordinary in the pictures. It's just dusty shelves and old desks. None of them capture the feeling of dread that weighed on me. None show the quick flashes of movement I thought I saw. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined certain details, but then I recall the door slamming shut on its own and how the building felt alive. I haven't told many people the full story, but in my own mind, I remain convinced that something lies dormant in that sealed library. The campus keeps it locked and quiet, hoping no one stirs up whatever remains there. I can still picture the rows of books covered in dust and the half-finished manuscripts with strange symbols. I know I didn't hallucinate that sudden whisper or the hush that followed every step I took. That place isn't just an old archive. It's a boundary between normal academics and something darker. I don't plan on crossing that threshold again. If anyone asks, I warn them not to pry. Sometimes knowledge buried in forgotten shelves should stay that way. I heard rumors about a strange ranch in Santa Rosa, where the walls were covered with masks from all over the world. People said the owners traveled extensively and brought back artifacts from different cultures. They also said the place had a weird energy. I was looking for a unique location to photograph, so I decided to check it out. I didn't believe in paranormal stuff, but I was curious about the exotic masks and the abandoned setting. I packed my camera gear and drove there one afternoon. When I arrived, I saw a large 2-story wooden house with peeling paint and boarded windows. The yard was full of tall grass and weeds. The entrance gates were slightly open, as if someone had left in a hurry. I parked my car near a fence and got out. I felt a slight chill in the air, even though it was a warm day. The ranch was silent. I saw no sign of people or animals. I walked toward the front door. On the way, I passed exterior walls adorned with carved masks. Some were painted, some were just raw wood, but they all had faces with intense expressions. I stopped to examine a few. Their eyes seemed to stare right at me. My chest felt tight. I brushed it off as nerves and kept going. The front porch creaked under my feet. I noticed the door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The house smelled stale, like dust and old furniture. It was dim, with just a bit of light streaming in through cracks in the boarded windows. Right above the doorway, another mask stared down at me. It had wide eyes and a mouth shaped like it was shouting. The interior walls were filled with more masks, some placed in neat rows, others hung in random clusters. They varied in size, color, and design. I set up my camera to take a few shots of the corridor. When I looked through the viewfinder, I felt this uncomfortable sense that some masks were angled differently than before. I took a step back and tried to shake that feeling. Then I heard a faint scraping sound behind me. It was like a footstep on a wooden floor. I spun around, but no one was there. My heart began to pound. My mind told me it was just the old house settling, so I continued down the hallway, snapping pictures. Every now and then, I thought I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned, I only saw more masks. I entered a large living area. There were couches covered with sheets, and along the walls, shelves and tables held carved figures, spears, bowls, and more masks propped up against the walls. The silence felt oppressive. Even my own breathing sounded loud. I took more photos, trying to capture the eerie atmosphere. My palms got sweaty. I checked the time. wanting to make sure I wouldn't be stuck here after dark. Suddenly, I heard a louder creak from upstairs. It sounded like someone was walking on the second floor. I froze, camera in hand, and listened. The sound stopped. I reminded myself that I was alone, or at least I thought I was. I decided to take a quick look. Maybe a squatter was living there. I crossed the living room and found a set of wooden stairs leading up. The steps were dusty. I shone my flashlight to see better. The rail felt sticky, as if it hadn't been cleaned for years. Each step made a dull squeak. As I went higher, the light from below grew weaker, and I had to rely on my flashlight. At the top, a hallway stretched out with a few doors on each side. Masks decorated the walls here too, some bigger and more ornate. I noticed one that had large feathers attached around its edges. The feathers were faded, but they still had a strange sheen when my flashlight passed over them. I peeked into the first room on my left. It looked like a bedroom with a small bed, a dresser, and a few suitcases lying around. The bed was stripped of sheets. Dust covered everything. A single mask sat on a shelf, smaller than the ones in the hallway, but with an intense expression. I snapped a photo. Then a sudden rustling behind me made me gasp and spin around. My flashlight beam darted across the hall, but I saw no one. I felt my heartbeat speed up. The rustling could have been the wind, but the windows were all boarded. I decided to keep going. I entered another bedroom. This one had a large mirror leaning against the wall, half covered by a blanket. Several masks rested on a table, and one was propped against the mirror. Through the camera lens, their hollow eyes looked even more unsettling. I could practically feel a charge in the air, like static electricity. Then the floorboards outside the room creaked loudly. I stepped into the hallway, shining my light down the corridor. It was empty. My pulse thumped in my neck. That's when I noticed a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, revealing what looked like a smaller staircase, maybe leading to an attic. I hesitated, but my curiosity won out. I walked carefully, trying not to make noise. I climbed the short attic stairs. It was cramped. At the top, there was another room, low-ceilinged, filled with crates and boxes. I saw more masks nailed to the rafters. Some looked African, some Asian, others from indigenous tribes. The designs varied widely, but they all shared intense, staring eyes. I felt a crawling sensation up my spine, as if I wasn't alone. My flashlight flickered. I tapped it, and it steadied, but that brief moment of darkness made me jerk in place. A sudden gust of wind, or maybe a draft, blew through the attic, making one of the masks sway on its nail. It bumped the rafter, creating a sharp clack. I flinched. Then I heard a low whisper, impossible to pinpoint. I couldn't discern words, just the sound of breathy murmuring. My throat went dry. I shot a few photos at random, hoping the flash might reveal something my eyes couldn't see. I backed out of the attic and hurried downstairs. As I reached the main floor, I noticed the living room felt colder. The front door was still ajar, so I stepped outside to catch my breath. The sun was sinking lower, creating long shadows in the yard. I considered leaving, but I hadn't taken pictures of the outside structures yet. A barn or a large shed stood off to the side, near the edge of the property. I forced myself to go there, determined to finish. The barn doors were slightly open. I pushed them and entered a big space with hay scattered on the ground, old farm equipment along the walls, and more of those carved masks hanging from support beams. My shoes kicked up dust as I walked. I raised my camera and took a few shots. The beam of light from the open door revealed more shapes at the back. I walked over and discovered several large masks hanging in a row. Some looked like animals, others like distorted human faces. That's when I felt an odd movement of air behind me. I heard a scrape, then a rustle, as if something had brushed against the wooden boards. My heart hammered. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the dark corners. Nothing. Then I heard a whisper again, similar to what I'd heard in the attic. It was like a low chanting, but I couldn't make out the words. I started to breathe faster. My thoughts raced. Maybe it was just the wind passing through cracks in the barn, but it felt more deliberate, like a voice. I decided I'd had enough. I turned toward the barn doors, but as I headed that way, one of the large masks was suddenly in my path on the ground. It hadn't been there before. I almost tripped over it. My stomach twisted, and I let out a sharp exhale. I nudged it aside with my foot, feeling a chill run through me. Then I hastened out of the barn, nearly stumbling over a broken piece of equipment. Out in the open again, I felt the cool evening air on my face. My body trembled. I walked briskly toward my car, glancing over my shoulder at the main house. The windows were dark, but I had a powerful sense that something inside was watching. I spotted a single mask hanging near the entrance, one I hadn't noticed before. It had a long face and narrow eyes. I locked eyes with it for a second. My pulse pounded as I fumbled with my keys. I got in my car, shut the door, and locked it. My breathing was uneven, and my hands shook. I started the engine, backed away, and sped off down the dirt driveway. Only once I hit the main road did I stop to collect myself. My heart still raced, and my shirt was damp with sweat. I felt relief leaving the property behind. I drove all the way home without turning on the radio, gripping the wheel with tense fingers. When I checked my camera photos that night, I saw mostly darkness and blur inside the house, like the images didn't register properly. The barn shots had strange smears of light and distortion. It was as if the camera couldn't capture what was really there. I had a couple of clearer shots showing the masks, but they looked ordinary in the pictures, just old wood and paint, no sign of the shifting angles or the strange presence I'd felt. I tried to tell a friend about my experience. He said maybe I was imagining things because I was in a creepy setting. But I know what I heard and saw, the shifting masks, the whispers, and the sudden movements that felt directed at me. I can still feel that tightness in my chest when I think about it. The memory of those eyes staring from every wall makes my skin crawl. I haven't gone back. I don't plan to. People say that ranch is for sale, but no one stays interested for long. The owners left most of their collections behind when they moved, which seems odd. Maybe they sensed something wasn't right. I suspect they brought home more than souvenirs from their travels. Whatever energy or spirit came attached to those masks is still there, waiting in that silent house and that dusty barn. I can still picture it all vividly, the blank windows, the musty rooms, and those carved faces that seemed to come alive when you weren't looking straight at them. Even now, I sometimes dream about stepping into that ranch again, camera in hand, hearing that soft chanting behind me. It's enough to keep me away. I don't want to risk hearing that whisper again. I don't want to see a mask on the ground blocking my way out. I've done a few more photo shoots since then, but I avoid remote spots like that. I feel uneasy whenever I see masks in people's homes, even harmless decorative ones. I can't shake the memory of those eyes that seemed to watch my every move in that lonely ranch in Santa Rosa. That place left me with a knot of dread that still surfaces when I think about it. I won't go back, and I tell anyone who asks me about it to stay away. It's not worth finding out what else might be hidden among those masks. I still remember the first time I heard about the old boardwalk on the Galveston shore. People in town said it used to be a small amusement spot long ago, back when they had food stands and a few simple rides. I don't like ghost stories, but they kept mentioning odd laughter echoing there at night and distant screams that made no sense. It sounded like gossip, but it kept coming up, so I decided to check it out for myself. I wanted to see if there was any truth to it. I picked a clear evening right before sunset and headed toward the beach, determined to walk all the way to the end of that abandoned stretch. When I got there, the sun was already sinking behind the Gulf of Mexico. The sky looked reddish and the air was salty. The boardwalk was a long strip of wood built out over the water, though parts of it looked rotted. Some sections had missing planks, and there were broken railings that might have been replaced with flimsy beams. I could see a couple of faded signs lying around, rusted and bent, as if someone had tossed them aside. One of them said something about a beach party, but the words were barely readable. I walked along the sand for a few minutes before stepping onto the wooden entrance. My heart began to pound. There was this uneasy feeling in my stomach that I couldn't shake. I told myself it was just the awkward sound of the boards creaking in the breeze. The wind blowing across the wooden structure made loud groans. It was like a door hinge that never got oiled. I had to watch my step because some planks felt loose under my feet. As I moved further, I saw abandoned snacks carts near the side, at least what was left of them. One of them might have been a popcorn cart. The metal was rusted, and the wheels were half buried in sand. Someone had left a torn canopy draped over it, but it was so tattered I couldn't tell what color it used to be. I kicked a piece of it out of my path. Then I noticed an old sign with the words, "Beach Party Tonight," or something similar, but the letters had mostly flaked off. The air felt heavier the farther I went. I didn't see anyone else around. Now and then I heard the water slapping against the posts beneath the boardwalk, but other than that, it was quiet. I thought I heard a whisper at one point, but I told myself it was just the wind. It started to get dark. The sun was pretty much gone, and I could only see the dull glow in the sky. The wooden boards under my feet made these loud squeaks that echoed in the emptiness. I felt my pulse in my neck. I was jumpy, stopping every few steps to listen. Then I caught a strange sound, a distant murmur, or maybe a laugh. I turned around quickly, but nobody was there. It got my heart racing. My chest felt tight and I swallowed, hoping I was just overthinking. I decided to keep going, but the path was missing a big chunk of boards ahead. Whoever had come here before had placed a narrow plank to bridge the gap. I stood there, checking the drop to the sand below. It wasn't a huge drop, but I didn't feel like falling through broken wood. I tested the plank with my foot. It bent a bit under my weight but didn't snap. I eased my way across, arms spread for balance. My breath got shallow. The wind picked up, blowing sand around, and my eyes stung. I tried to blink it away. Right after I made it across, something felt off. The air felt colder. It was like stepping into a different space, even though I was still outside. Everything looked darker. The lights from the street behind me seemed dimmer, almost like they had been covered by a layer of shadows. I noticed that my skin was crawling. The hair on my arms stood on end. I thought maybe there was a storm coming in from the Gulf. Then I heard it again, that faint laughter. It sounded like a child's laugh, but far away. I froze in place. The boards creaked beneath me when I put my weight on my heels. I tried to calm my breathing. I pointed my flashlight around, but it barely illuminated anything. I cursed under my breath for not bringing a better light source. The beam just bounced off the water and showed me more broken stands and scraps of old carnival junk. I took a few steps forward and something flickered at the very end of the boardwalk. I strained my eyes. It looked like small, colorful lights blinking on and off, like string lights you might see during a fair. I wondered if there was some power supply still running. That made no sense to me, but I was determined to see what was causing it. My heart pounded so hard I could hear my blood rush in my ears. As I got closer, I began to make out silhouettes. It looked like shapes of people moving around. My legs felt shaky. I tried to keep the flashlight steady, but my hands were trembling. Then I heard more than just laughter. I heard voices, chattering, maybe even cheering, as if a small crowd was gathered. I stepped forward again, and the boards moaned under my weight. The silhouettes seemed to dance or at least move back and forth. A faint swirl of color moved near them, almost like a set of carnival lights. I heard an engine hum, or maybe it was mechanical squeaking. It reminded me of a Ferris wheel or some kind of old ride. My throat felt dry. I swallowed, but my mouth had gone tacky. The lights flickered again. For a split second, I saw what looked like an old-fashioned carnival ride. A giant wheel. It had broken spokes, a few bent sections, and missing seats. But in that flash, I thought I saw kids or small figures occupying some of the seats, even though the ride was obviously wrecked. They looked like dark outlines, swaying and turning. Then the lights went out, and it was just me staring at a ruined Ferris wheel that was definitely not operational. My mind raced. I wondered if I was hallucinating. My neck was stiff from tension. I pointed the flashlight at the wheel, but I only saw rusted metal. I leaned forward, trying to see if anyone was there. All I saw was an empty shell. My palms felt sweaty. I tried to breathe slowly. I stepped backward. Then I heard giggles right behind me. I jerked around. Nothing. I took another step. Suddenly the lights flashed again. I saw those silhouettes near the wheel, like small children. I heard them chanting or singing a tune that I couldn't fully catch. It was high-pitched, almost playful. I froze, my knees feeling weak. Then the lights vanished again, and I was alone. The emptiness felt heavier than before. That was it. I turned around, ready to leave, but the board beneath my foot cracked. I almost lost my balance. I caught myself against a rickety handrail, and it swayed dangerously. My chest tightened, and I sucked in air. I forced myself to step carefully so I wouldn't fall through any more rotten wood. As I made my way back, I heard footsteps behind me. They weren't heavy footsteps, more like soft pitter-patter. I glanced back with the flashlight. No one was there, but every time I moved, the footsteps seemed to keep pace. My chest burned. My head started throbbing. My eyes darted left and right, checking the corners of the boardwalk. I reached the plank again. Crossing it now felt 10 times harder because my legs were shaking. I dropped to one knee and crawled across, feeling the plank bend under me. My heart pounded so loud that it drowned out the sound of the waves. Halfway across, I heard a child's voice behind me. It just said something like, "Don't go," or maybe it was just a shriek. Either way, I scrambled off the plank as fast as I could. When I stood up, I felt an icy breeze brush against my back. My jacket rippled. I turned and saw nothing but darkness. The hush was broken by faint rustling and maybe some light scraping sounds. I couldn't tell if it was the wind or something else. I realized my face was covered in sweat and my hands felt clammy. I hurried toward the entrance, but I nearly tripped on something. It was one of those old popcorn carts. It was in a different spot than before, which made my stomach twist. I was sure it had been closer to the rail. Now it was right in my path. I quickly stepped around it. Then I heard a high-pitched laugh behind me. I swung the flashlight around. Empty boards, just the same broken rail and old signs. My breathing got ragged. My eyes started stinging with fear, or maybe tears of relief that I was almost free. I kept moving. When I finally saw the start of the boardwalk, my body felt lighter, like I'd emerged from deep water. I rushed off the wooden walkway onto the sand. My legs felt wobbly, but I was so glad to be off that rotting structure. I paused to catch my breath, my hands on my thighs. I could smell the regular beach air again, that salty tang. It smelled normal, like I was back in the real world. I turned around for one last look and saw a vague figure at the entrance. It was small, probably the size of a child, though I couldn't make out any details. I blinked, and it was gone. Then I heard a sharp giggle echo across the shore. My throat clenched, and I stumbled backward. I walked across the sand, not looking back again. When I reached my car, I sat behind the wheel and realized my hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't turn the key for a moment. My mind buzzed with what I'd seen and heard. I tried to reassure myself that I'd imagined half of it, but a voice in my head told me something else. It said that the old boardwalk still had some kind of presence. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't natural. I told a few friends about it the next day, and one of them knew a local man named Garrett who had a similar experience. He warned people not to go there because he heard the same laughter and saw shapes that made no sense. He suspected that the broken rides and stands were stuck in a weird limbo, appearing when they shouldn't. I felt a knot in my stomach while listening to him. He described the strange lights, the children's voices, and how he sometimes felt like the wood under his feet was going to crumble the moment he set foot on it. His face looked pale as he recalled the memory. He swore he would never return, even if someone paid him. I didn't argue, even though part of me wanted to go back with better equipment to document everything. The rest of me never wanted to see that place again. My dreams were full of flickering images for weeks. I'd bolt upright in bed, feeling like I'd heard childish laughter right outside my window. It subsided after some time, but I avoided that end of the beach from then on. Whenever I had to pass near that stretch of Galveston shore, I took a different route. I didn't want to glimpse those ruined boards or the battered popcorn cart again. Later, I discovered that the boardwalk used to host small fairs and weekend attractions decades ago. They had a few rides, carnival games, and a short pier for people to fish. One summer, a freak storm hit. It swept part of the structure away, and apparently a few kids were missing afterward. People said they were found safe, but some local rumors hinted otherwise. There was talk about one child who fell through the broken planks and wasn't found for days. The stories didn't quite align, but they all described screams and sudden vanishings. After that, business dried up. No one wanted to invest in repairs. It's been closed ever since. Whenever someone new in town tries to open it back up, rumors or accidents scare them off. Some folks say it's just an old boardwalk that needs to be torn down. Others believe it's too deeply haunted by leftover energy. I don't claim to understand it, but I know what I saw. I still remember the hush of the place, the cold air, the flickering lights, and the silhouettes on that broken Ferris wheel. It didn't feel like a dream, and I can't explain it away. Now, if anyone ever asks me about the boardwalk, I tell them to stay away. I say it's too risky, and if they don't believe me, that's their choice. I refuse to set foot there again. I don't want to hear those voices or catch a glimpse of those shapes in the dark. Some things should stay hidden, and that lonely stretch of wood in Galveston is one of them. I still get chills when I think about the squeaking planks and the sound of quiet laughter that came from nowhere. The memory keeps me from ever returning to that spot, and that's all I need to know. I heard about the old catacombs under a Boston cemetery from an archive I was studying as part of a research project. The documents mentioned secret underground passages, possibly used by hidden groups in the past. At first I thought these references were exaggerated or based on local folklore. Then I found an older map in the city records. It showed a series of tunnels branching out beneath an established cemetery with strange annotations like meeting chamber and sealed corridor. That caught my attention. I wanted to see if there was any truth to the rumors. I managed to get informal permission to inspect the site at night. I didn't want to involve too many people in case it turned out to be nothing. I arrived at the cemetery just after sunset. The caretaker had gone home, leaving the gates open for my visit. The wind was cool, and the tall historic headstones cast long shadows in the moonlight. Most of the graves dated back to the 1700s and 1800s. The atmosphere felt tense in a quiet way. My shoes crunched on gravel paths as I walked, carrying a small flashlight and a shoulder bag with a couple of tools, including an old set of keys the archive suggested might fit certain locks down below. The instructions on the map indicated I should start at a particular mausoleum near the eastern edge. It was a boxy, stone structure with a heavy door secured by a padlock. The name etched above the entrance was mostly worn away, leaving only a few readable letters. I tried the keys I had, and one of them fit the padlock. It took some effort to push the door open. The hinges squeaked, and a stale odor drifted out. The air inside smelled of damp stone and old dust. I used the flashlight to scan the small chamber. Stone coffins or sarcophagi lined the walls. The ceiling was arched, and the floor felt uneven under my feet. I ran the beam of light around until I saw a set of steps leading downward behind one of the larger coffins. They were mostly hidden by a slab that looked like it had been slid aside. My heartbeat picked up. I approached carefully, aiming the flashlight to see if there was a clear path below. The steps vanished into darkness. I stepped onto the top stair, my pulse pounding in my ears. Each stair was narrow, and I had to keep one hand on the wall for balance. The cold stone felt damp against my palm. At the bottom, I found a short hallway that opened into a corridor, just wide enough for a single person. I shone the flashlight along the walls and spotted torch brackets that no longer held torches. Everything smelled musty and old, and the air was heavy. My lungs felt tight. The silence pressed on my ears, broken only by the sound of my breathing. I moved forward, trying not to trip on loose stones. The corridor soon led to a small chamber with multiple branching paths. I checked the map. It had vague labels for each tunnel, but time had faded much of the ink. I saw some symbols carved into the wall, crosses, triangles, and letters that might have been Latin. My heart thudded. It felt like I was stepping back in time or intruding on something private. I tried to remain calm, telling myself this was just an old crypt system, not necessarily a place of active gatherings. I chose the left tunnel first, since the map suggested it led to a larger room. The tunnel was narrow, and my flashlight revealed stone shelves carved into the walls. Some held decaying wooden boxes or fragments of bone. My stomach clenched at the sight of partial remains. The air felt colder, and I noticed a faint drip of water from the ceiling. Each drop echoed loudly. After about 20 yards, I arrived at a bigger chamber with an arched roof. The center held a circular stone table surrounded by rough benches. Symbols were etched on the floor around it, crude shapes that I didn't recognize. I walked around the perimeter, shining my flashlight on each symbol. I felt unsettled, as if I had stepped into a meeting space. The stillness made my skin crawl. I examined one corner and spotted broken stone fragments. They looked like they might have once been part of a statue or column. Suddenly, I heard a soft scuffing sound behind me. I spun around, flashlight raised. There was no one. My heart pounded harder. Maybe it was a trick of my own footsteps echoing, but I didn't think so. I waited, listening. Nothing else happened. My mouth was dry, and I forced myself to breathe slower. I decided to check another part of the catacombs before I lost my nerve. Returning to the main corridor, I followed the map's rough outline to a passage labeled Deeper Galleries. The tunnel took a sharp turn down a ramp, and the walls got wet and slippery. I nearly lost my footing once. The flashlight revealed niches in the stone, some empty, others containing rotting wood or scattered bones. I tried not to look too closely. A sense of intrusion weighed on me. Still, I wanted to see if the map's mention of a hidden library or repository was accurate. The ramp ended at a heavy wooden door. It was partially open, the wood swollen and discolored by moisture. I pushed it, and it scraped against the floor. Beyond was a cramped space lined with shelves of books and scrolls, all in various stages of decay. My eyes widened. I hadn't expected anything so extensive. I stepped in, sweeping the flashlight across the shelves. Most of the bindings were crumbling, and I worried that touching them might destroy them further. I noticed a large table in the center with melted candle stubs. The wax was hardened into pools. That meant someone had burned candles here, but I couldn't tell how long ago. As I took a closer look at the shelves, a faint breeze stirred the air, flickering dust motes in my flashlight beam. The breeze should have been impossible in such a closed-off space. My neck prickled. Then I heard a soft shuffle near the doorway. I whipped around. The flashlight's beam caught a flicker of movement. It seemed like a shadow slipping into the hallway. My blood ran cold. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice echoed off the stone walls, but no one answered. I realized I was trembling. The idea of someone else being down here, moving quietly in the dark, terrified me. I weighed my options: stay and confront whoever it was, or leave immediately. Fear spiked in my chest, but my curiosity still tugged at me. I took a step into the corridor, shining the flashlight around. The emptiness was suffocating. I saw no figure, no obvious footprints. Still, my gut told me I wasn't alone. I decided it wasn't safe to linger. I backtracked toward the entrance, following the corridors as best I could in reverse order. Each step felt heavier. I kept imagining someone silently trailing me. At one point, I heard a faint clink of stone. I paused, gripping the flashlight with sweaty hands, but I saw nothing in the darkness. I forced myself to keep moving, ignoring the pounding in my ears. My mind spun with questions about who might be down there. Could it be a caretaker, a group of explorers, or something else entirely? After what felt like an eternity, I found the original staircase that led up to the mausoleum. Climbing those steps felt like escaping a tomb. The closer I got to the top, the clearer the night air smelled. I emerged into the mausoleum chamber with the stone coffins. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Then I heard another sound, soft footsteps from behind the coffin. I aimed my flashlight, but there was only stone and shadows. My stomach clenched. I hurried to the door and stepped outside. Fresh air never felt so good. I inhaled deeply, tasting the night breeze instead of stale crypt air. My hands still shook, and my heart pounded. I swung the mausoleum door closed and locked the padlock. I lingered for a moment, scanning the darkness of the cemetery. The moonlight illuminated rows of headstones. Everything looked still, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hush of the graveyard pressed in around me. I walked back along the gravel path, every nerve on alert. The caretaker's small office at the gate was dark. I reached my car, fumbled with the keys, and finally got the door open. I sank into the driver's seat, my pulse racing. My breath came in short gasps. I forced myself to calm down enough to start the engine. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure in the back seat. There was no one, but my paranoia lingered. As I drove away, my mind replayed everything I had seen: the hidden passages, the old meeting chamber, the potential library with rotting books, and the unexplained sounds. It was all proof that there really were catacombs beneath that cemetery, possibly used by secret societies or clandestine groups. But the sensation of another presence there shook me more than any architectural discovery. I kept checking my mirrors for headlights or movement, worried I might have angered someone or stumbled onto something I shouldn't have. That night, I barely slept. My body felt tense, and every little noise made me sit up, heart pounding. In the following days, I studied the map again, wondering if I had missed anything. But each time I recalled the shadow I glimpsed, my stomach knotted. I wasn't ready to return. I wrote up a few notes about the layout, the strange symbols, and the library. I stored them in a locked file on my computer. Part of me wanted to share these findings with a historian or a reporter, but another part feared drawing attention. If someone was active down there, they might not want their secret revealed. For now, I keep my experiences mostly to myself. I tell close friends that I explored an old crypt and found some interesting tunnels, but I spare them the details of the footsteps and the feeling of being watched. I don't mention the library or the carved symbols. The place still haunts my thoughts, especially late at night when I'm trying to fall asleep. Sometimes I dream about those corridors, hearing echoes in the darkness. I wake up uneasy, remembering the chill of the catacombs and the possibility that I was never alone down there. I haven't gone back. I don't intend to without a strong reason. The catacombs under that cemetery in Boston hold more than just bones and crumbling books. They contain a living history of secrets, hidden meetings, and who knows what else. I sense that the people who once used those tunnels may not be entirely gone. The entire experience left me uneasy about what still lurks below the city's surface. For now, I'm content to keep my distance and let those passages remain in the shadows where I found them. I decided to return to the old elementary school in Mobile, Alabama, after many years away. I went there as a child, but it closed sometime in the 1980s, following a decline in enrollment and a rumored outbreak of illness. I still don't know all the details. I just remember that one day my parents told me the school had shut down, and I would be attending a different one. I was young and didn't question it. Now, I'm older, and I felt drawn back to see the place where I learned my ABCs and played on the swings with friends. I drove through quiet streets until I reached a narrow road with cracks in the pavement. The entrance to the school was blocked by a locked gate, but the chain on it looked thin. Overgrown weeds ran along the fence line. The old sign near the gate had lost most of its letters, so only a few rusted metal pieces remained. The building itself stood a short distance away, with boarded windows and walls streaked with grime. My focus, though, was on the playground just visible behind the main structure. I recognized the silhouettes of the old slides and monkey bars even from afar. I got out of my car and walked along the fence, searching for a weak spot. I found a section where someone had cut away part of the chain link, leaving a gap I could squeeze through. It felt odd to be sneaking in, but I doubted anyone cared. The property was abandoned, and the city seemed to have forgotten it. As I slipped through, my jacket caught on a jagged edge, making a tearing sound. I cursed under my breath and pulled free, leaving a small rip behind. The yard was overgrown. Knee-high grass and weeds covered most of the asphalt. I remembered a large blacktop area where we used to play foursquare. Now it was cracked and invaded by green shoots. I kept walking until I reached the playground itself. I saw the metal swing set, its chains rusted, the swings hanging askew. The slide stood next to it, discolored with patches of rust. Nearby sat a merry-go-round missing a couple of its handrails. The wind picked up, and one of the swings moved slightly, producing a squeaking sound. It set my nerves on edge. I was pretty sure it was just the breeze, but I couldn't help feeling tense. The place looked sad, like a memory frozen in time. Yet there was something more, an unshakable sense that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just the weight of old memories. I walked over to the swings first. The seat in the middle had lost most of its rubber covering, revealing cracked plastic. I put my hand on the chain. It felt cold and rough. The squeak repeated, this time louder. I glanced at the slide, wondering if the wind had also rattled that. I saw a small patch of footprints in the dusty ground near the slide's ladder. They looked recent, maybe a child's footprints. My pulse quickened. I couldn't explain how fresh footprints would appear here, especially child-sized ones. I bent down to examine them. The shape was distinct. A small shoe, the kind you might see on an elementary-age kid. The prints led toward the monkey bars and then vanished where the grass grew thick. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe some local kids snuck in occasionally to play, ignoring the rust and danger. Still, something about the prints unsettled me. As I straightened up, I heard a faint giggle. It was quick, almost like a breathy laugh, and then it was gone. I turned in a circle, scanning every inch of the yard. The only movement I saw was the swing continuing to sway. My heart pounded. I realized I was holding my breath, so I forced myself to breathe normally. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" No reply came, just the distant sound of wind through the tall grass. I moved toward the monkey bars. The metal rungs looked corroded. Some had snapped and dangled loosely. I remembered climbing them as a kid, feeling proud when I could swing from one end to the other without dropping. Now, they seemed one strong pull away from collapsing. On the ground beneath them, I found a torn piece of cloth. It looked like part of a small T-shirt, maybe bright in color at one time, but now faded to a dirty pastel shade. I picked it up, and the fabric felt damp, but not like it had been soaked in rain. I couldn't identify the source of the moisture. I dropped it and wiped my hand on my jeans. A sudden thud made me jump. It came from behind me, near the slides. My heart thumped in my chest as I hurried back over. I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the old structure leaning in the same spot. The rusted surface looked more ominous now that the sun had dipped behind a cloud. Another squeak of metal echoed, and I jerked my head toward the merry-go-round. Its circular platform spun slightly, as if someone had given it a push, but there was no one there. My throat felt tight. I couldn't shake the idea that something was watching me. I kept turning in circles, expecting to see a child dart behind a wall or an adult scolding me for trespassing, but I saw no one. Then came another sound, a faint series of small footsteps running across concrete. They were quick, like a child at play. I pivoted, pointing my flashlight, I had pulled it from my jacket pocket, toward the direction of the noise. The light revealed the broken blacktop, overgrown weeds, but no moving figure. A chill ran through me despite the Alabama heat. My stomach felt knotted. I thought about leaving right then, but a strange need to understand what was happening pulled me deeper into the yard. I spotted the main building's back entrance. The door was ajar. I wondered if the footsteps I heard had gone inside. I moved closer to the door. It hung crooked on its hinges, the wood warped. There was a faint smell coming from inside, like old paper and mildew. I took a few steps in and found a dim hallway littered with debris, broken desks, torn posters, and scattered books. My footstep crunched on something. I looked down and saw a water-damaged notebook. The cover was peeling off, but a name was still visible in smeared marker. It belonged to a child, and the date inside was from decades ago. My heart panged with a mixture of sadness and unease. I heard another giggle, echoing off the hallway walls. It came from a side corridor that led toward the cafeteria, if my memory served right. I was torn between leaving immediately and following the sound. Against my better judgment, I went to investigate. I turned the corner into a side hallway with lockers on each side. The doors were rusted, and some hung open. One banged softly, as if recently disturbed. I raised my flashlight and saw footprints in the dusty floor, small ones, again heading deeper into the school. The air felt heavy, and my ears picked up a distant humming, like a child singing under their breath. My skin prickled. I forced my legs to move forward, though every fiber in me screamed to turn back. After maybe 30 feet, the footprints veered toward a set of double doors that probably led to the old cafeteria. I approached cautiously. The door on the right was stuck, but the left one gave way with a push, letting out a groan from the hinges. I shone my flashlight across the large, dark room. Broken tables and chairs were strewn about. The odor of rot was stronger here, and I covered my nose with my sleeve. Another giggle echoed, this time close enough to send my heart into a frenzy. Suddenly, a metal tray clattered to the floor somewhere behind the serving counter. I nearly dropped my flashlight. My mouth went dry, and my mind raced, imagining what could be in that kitchen area. I stepped backward, not wanting to go any farther. Then I heard small footsteps again, moving away. They grew fainter until they vanished. Silence followed. I decided I'd seen enough. My curiosity wasn't worth the fear creeping over me. I retraced my steps quickly, stumbling a few times over debris. I made it back to the playground outside. The sky had darkened further, and the old structures looked like silhouettes. That's when I noticed something near the swings. In the dim light, it appeared like a small figure crouched by the broken seat. I froze. I couldn't see details, just a shape that looked child-sized, barely more than a shadow. My hands shook, and my breath came in short gasps. I aimed my flashlight at the figure, but the beam sputtered, and for a second, the light dimmed. When it brightened again, the figure was gone. The swing moved as if recently touched. I heard the faint words, "Play with us," echo in my ears, but they could have been a trick of my own mind. I was done. I sprinted across the yard, not caring if I tripped on weeds or debris. My lungs burned by the time I reached the fence. I shoved myself back through the cut link, nearly tearing my jacket again. Once on the other side, I ran to my car, yanked the door open, and slid into the driver's seat. My hands trembled as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned over, and I pulled onto the road, glancing back only once. In my rearview mirror, the old building receded into darkness. My pulse pounded for several minutes as I drove away. By the time I reached safer, well-lit streets, I tried to make sense of what I'd experienced. The footprints, the laughter, the movement on the swings, that shadowy shape, it all felt real and impossible at the same time. I had no photographs, no recordings, only my own stunned memory. I wanted to explain it as my imagination running wild in a creepy setting, but I kept replaying the sounds in my mind. The sense of being followed and observed lingered, making me check my back seat more than once during the drive. Eventually, I told a close friend about it. She said there were stories of children who died during that illness outbreak, that some believed their spirits never left the schoolyard. I wasn't a believer in ghosts before, but the experience shook me enough that I can't dismiss the idea. I haven't returned to that place. I don't plan to. There was too much tension in the air, too many unexplained sounds and sights. That playground remains in my memory as a place stuck in time, carrying echoes of children who never got to finish their childhoods. I still wonder if what I heard and saw was something real or just the power of suggestion. But I can't forget the chills I felt or the giggles that seemed to circle me when no one else was there. The abandoned school in Mobile stands as a silent reminder that some sites hold more than just old walls and rusty swings. They hold a presence that can still reach out even after decades of neglect. And I'm not going back to test those whispers again. I first heard about the old drive-in theater on the outskirts of Bakersfield from an online forum. Someone mentioned a place where, on certain nights, a faded screen still lit up with old black and white films. They claimed you could see shadowy figures inside their cars, as though an invisible crowd had gathered to watch a movie. I found it hard to believe. Drive-ins are mostly gone now, but I'm a nostalgic person. I wanted to see if there was any truth to it, so I made plans to visit. I arrived in Bakersfield late one afternoon, planning to check out the location before dark. The map took me to a deserted stretch of road outside town. I saw rusted fences, broken signs, and overgrown weeds on both sides. The sky was turning orange as the sun dipped low. I spotted a large rectangular structure in the distance that I assumed was the old screen. It looked grimy and half collapsed from afar. A few leaning poles stuck out of the ground. I guessed those might have been the speakers in the old days. I parked by what looked like a gate. It was missing most of its chain link, and the sign overhead had missing letters. The broken asphalt under my tires crunched with bits of gravel. Weeds poked through the cracks. I stepped out of my car, feeling the temperature drop. The dusty air smelled stale. I saw no sign of other people or recent activity. Everything looked abandoned. I took a moment to scan the area. The screen, if you could still call it that, was a giant sheet of metal propped by worn beams. The middle part had a large rectangular patch that might once have been white. Now it was grayish-brown with rust streaks. I walked through what used to be the main lot. Rows of raised asphalt humps marked where cars would have parked. The speaker poles were mostly bent or missing. A few had battered metal boxes hanging off them, the cords cut. I ran my hand over one, feeling chipped paint and sharp rust. It felt lifeless, but I also felt a subtle tension, like stepping onto a stage after the audience has gone home. I heard distant traffic from the highway, but otherwise it was silent. The sun set quickly, and I realized I should have arrived earlier if I wanted to inspect the place in daylight. I had a flashlight with me, but the open lot didn't require much light yet. I walked closer to the screen. The posts supporting it looked dangerously weak. The old projection booth was just a concrete shell with no roof. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight around. The floor was covered in broken glass, scraps of metal, and what looked like an old reel or two of film that had turned to brittle strips. There was no projector in sight, just the remains of what might have been a control panel. The wind whistled through the empty windows. I left the booth and wandered back toward the main lot. Dusk had settled, and the light was fading fast. I decided to stay a while and see if anything happened. I leaned against my car, arms folded, scanning the empty space. Nothing stirred. I felt a little foolish, waiting for some ghostly show to begin. Then, just as the last bit of sunlight disappeared, a faint flicker drew my eye to the screen. At first, it seemed like a reflection, or maybe my imagination. But then it got brighter, and I realized the big, rusted screen was actually lighting up. My chest tightened with shock. There was no electricity here, no visible generator or power source. Yet, a dim black and white image was forming on the battered metal surface. It flickered a bit, like an old film with missing frames. My heart pounded. I took a few steps closer. The image showed a vintage scene. A man in a tuxedo and a woman in a long dress standing on a set that resembled a ballroom. Their lips moved, but I heard no sound. The picture was grainy and full of scratches, as if it were a damaged reel from decades ago. I struggled to swallow. My mouth felt dry. I stood there, unsure of what to do. A part of me wanted to run back to my car and leave. Another part insisted I should observe more, maybe get proof. I lifted my phone and tried to record a video. I could see the flicker on my phone screen, but it looked even more distorted. Just then, I heard a soft noise from behind me, like the distant hum of car engines. I turned and saw nothing but shadows among the broken speaker posts. Yet, I sensed the presence of other watchers. I moved slowly between the rows, shining my flashlight around. The ground was uneven, and I stumbled on a loose chunk of asphalt. I heard a faint whiff of static, as though an old radio station was trying to come through. My flashlight caught glimpses of shapes at the corners of my vision, but whenever I focused, they vanished. My heartbeat thudded so loud I could hear it in my ears. I heard a soft murmur of voices, but the lot appeared empty. Suddenly, the film on the screen froze on a single frame. It showed the woman's face in a close-up, tears in her eyes. The light pulsed a few times, then went dark. The entire lot was plunged into darkness. My pulse raced. I turned to face the screen again, and it was pitch black. Then, from several directions around me, I heard something like small engines revving and car doors creaking. I whipped around with my flashlight, seeing only weeds and broken poles. I called out, "Hello?" My voice came out shaky. No one answered. The sounds continued for a moment. Car engines, quiet conversation, even a few beeps of old car horns. My chest felt tight, and my fingers gripped the flashlight until my knuckles ached. The night pressed in on me. Then, as quickly as it started, the noises faded. I was left with only the wind. I exhaled, realizing I had been holding my breath. The silence felt suffocating. I tried to rationalize. Maybe this was a trick of the wind or distant highway noises echoing strangely. But deep down, I knew what I heard was too detailed for that. I decided to return to my car and maybe watch from there. As I stepped back, I noticed faint shadows near the corners of the lot. They looked like silhouettes leaning against invisible cars. My heart lurched. The shapes seemed to turn their heads in my direction. I could barely see them in the dim moonlight. Then one of them stepped forward, and I saw nothing but empty air. The shape vanished. I felt goosebumps erupt on my arms. I reached my car, jumped in, and locked the doors. My breathing was quick, and I wiped sweat from my forehead. The overhead lamp in my car was the only light around. I fumbled with my keys, half thinking I should just drive off. But curiosity gripped me. I rolled down the window an inch, listening. The night was quiet again. I glanced at the screen through my windshield, but it remained dark. After a few minutes, I calmed down a bit. That was when a sudden flicker lit up the screen again. This time, I could see the same black and white film continuing from where it froze. The woman on screen was now hugging the man. The edges of the image crackled, and the scene repeated in a loop. I heard a faint echo of car horns. My breathing grew shaky, and I felt a chill despite the warm night air. I checked around me, but the lot looked as empty as ever. Then I became aware of shadows moving in my peripheral vision. They were in the spots where cars would have parked. Some shapes stood upright as if leaning against a car door, while others seemed to be seated. My hands began to tremble on the steering wheel. I could almost sense their eyes turned toward the screen. I wanted to turn on my headlights, but I was scared of what I might see. I kept them off and stayed still. A few seconds later, the film froze again. The screen went dark. I braced myself for more sounds. Sure enough, I heard muffled voices, like people chatting or laughing. It felt like I was in a theater crowd, except I could see no one. A strange wave of fear washed over me, mixed with an odd sadness. It felt like these people were still attending a show that ended decades ago. I couldn't bear it any longer. My nerves were on edge. I started the engine. The roar felt too loud in the quiet lot. I shifted into reverse, carefully scanning behind me to make sure I wasn't running into anything. Nothing was there, only cracked asphalt and weeds. Yet, as I backed up, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror of something moving across the back of my car. My heart leaped. I slammed the brakes. My chest felt like it would explode. Then the shape was gone. I pressed the accelerator lightly, steering back toward the broken gate. My palms felt clammy on the wheel. Once I got onto the main road, I drove faster than I should have, wanting to put distance between myself and that drive-in. My thoughts raced. My mouth felt dry, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something followed me. After about 15 minutes, I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road to catch my breath. My pulse was still pounding. I replayed the entire experience in my mind, trying to make sense of it. The silent film, the flickering screen, the shapes in the lot, the echoes of old engines and car horns. It was too detailed to be a trick of my imagination. Back in town, I asked around about the drive-in. A local diner waitress said it closed years ago after a fire destroyed the projection booth. Some people got trapped inside, though the details were murky. She had heard rumors that sometimes, on a quiet night, the screen lit up by itself. She didn't seem surprised that I had seen something strange. She just shrugged and said the place was cursed by memories that wouldn't let go. I left Bakersfield soon after that. The images stayed with me. I kept thinking about those ghostly viewers, returning to the same incomplete screening over and over. When I tried to watch the video I recorded, most of it was dark and unfocused. There was no evidence of what I'd seen on the screen, just a shaky blur. My phone's audio picked up a little static, but nothing conclusive. I decided not to share it. Who would believe me anyway? It's been a while since that night, but I still recall the chill I felt when the film suddenly lit up the battered screen. I remember the faint outline of figures in places where there were no cars, and I remember the silence turning into a chorus of invisible engines and hushed voices. That place felt stuck in time, replaying an old night of cinema for an audience that never left. I visited other abandoned spots, but none of them ever made my skin crawl like that drive-in on the outskirts of Bakersfield. I'm not planning to go back. The memories are enough to remind me that some places remain haunted by their own past, replaying lost moments for anyone foolish enough to wander in. I arrived in Whitefish, Montana at the start of January. The roads were icy, and the temperature hovered around freezing. I had rented a remote cabin by a lake because I wanted solitude and a quiet place to work on my writing. The rental ad mentioned beautiful snow-covered scenery and easy access to the frozen shoreline. I thought it would be a peaceful location to clear my head. The drive took me along winding highways, past fields covered in snow. As I approached the cabin, I noticed the lake. It stretched out behind some pine trees, a wide expanse of ice. The surface looked smooth and white, almost blending with the snow on the ground. The cabin itself was small, built from logs that had darkened with age. A narrow porch faced the water. The path to the front door was half buried in fresh snow. I parked my car and turned off the engine. Silence settled around me, except for a faint wind that brushed against the bare branches. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards creaked under my boots. Inside, the cabin was basic. A small kitchen area, a living room with a wood stove, and a single bedroom off to the side. Everything looked clean, though a bit worn. I turned on the lights and felt a slight draft near the windows. I checked the thermostat, set it to a comfortable level, and then brought in the rest of my supplies. Once I had a fire going in the stove, I felt more at ease. The orange glow lit up the living space and kept the chill out. That first afternoon was calm. I opened my laptop at the small table near the window. The lake stretched across my view, frozen and silent. The sky was overcast, and the light started to fade earlier than I expected. I typed a few paragraphs, trying to concentrate, but found myself getting up to look outside every few minutes. Something about the lake drew my attention. It looked empty, yet I felt a trace of unease. I dismissed it as nerves from traveling. Around dusk, I decided to step out for a quick walk. I bundled up in a thick coat, gloves, and a hat. The snow crunched under my feet, and the air was so cold it stung my face. I walked to the edge of the lake and tapped the ice with my boot. It felt solid. I knew Whitefish winters were harsh, and locals often skated or fished on the ice. I stepped out a little, testing my weight. The ice held firm. A mild wind blew across the open space, making me shiver. I saw no cracks or weak spots, so I ventured a bit farther. Then I stopped to listen. A faint groaning sound came from beneath me. I knew that ice sometimes shifts or expands, but it unnerved me anyway. It resembled a low moan, as though the lake itself was complaining. I reminded myself that this was normal in frozen lakes. Still, I felt my heart rate climb. I turned around and walked back to the shore, deciding I'd had enough of the cold. By the time I got inside, darkness had fully settled. I locked the door and settled in for the night. A few hours later, I was lying in bed, reading on my tablet. The cabin was quiet, except for the sound of the wind outside. Then I heard a noise that raised the hair on my arms. It was a distant scraping sound, as if something was dragging across the ice. I propped myself up, listening closely. It stopped. I tried to relax, telling myself it was just a branch or an animal crossing the lake. After a few minutes, I heard another noise, almost like a muffled thud from far away. My stomach tightened. I checked the time, nearly midnight. I switched off my tablet and tried to sleep. The wind picked up and rattled the window. Eventually, I dozed off. The next morning, I stepped outside to see the lake in daylight. Low clouds hung over the area, and the breeze made the surface look slightly textured, though still frozen solid. A light dusting of snow covered everything. I decided to focus on my writing that day. For a while, it went well. I found a decent rhythm and managed to write several pages. By afternoon, I felt restless. I stepped outside again, curious to see if there were any footprints or animal tracks on the lake's edge. I noticed faint impressions on the snow near the shoreline, maybe deer or rabbits. I followed them, checking for any sign of motion beneath the ice. The surface seemed opaque and still. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the temperature dropped quickly. I returned to the cabin and fixed myself a simple dinner. While I ate, I heard a long cracking sound from outside. It echoed through the quiet. My heart jumped. I glanced out the window. The lake looked the same, no visible cracks or breaks. Yet the sound persisted, like large segments of ice shifting. I closed the curtains, trying to block out the thought of what might be happening beneath that frozen surface. Around midnight, I woke to a strange moaning again. It seemed louder than the previous night. My pulse pounded. I got up, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and walked to the window. I peered through a small gap in the curtain. The moon provided some light, though it was cloudy. On the lake's surface, I thought I saw shapes moving under the ice, dark forms sliding beneath the frozen crust. My chest tightened. I couldn't see them clearly, but there was definite movement. I stepped back, not wanting to look any longer. My mind spun with questions. Nothing could survive in that kind of cold, especially not under layers of ice. I told myself it might be shadows or cracks forming. I tried to settle back into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. I drifted in and out of a half-conscious state, listening for more sounds. A few times I heard faint scraping, like nails on glass. I jolted awake at least twice, sure that something was out on the lake. By dawn, I felt exhausted. On the third day, I made a decision. I would check the ice up close again, take some photos, and see if I could calm my nerves by facing it directly. After lunch, I put on my coat and boots and walked out onto the lake, staying near the shallow end. The ice held firm under my weight. I crouched down, aiming my phone camera at the surface. There were hairline fractures in some places, but nothing unusual for a frozen lake. Then I heard a distant popping noise. The ice vibrated beneath my feet, and I nearly lost my balance. I stood up quickly, my heart hammering. I was about to head back when I heard a muffled scream. It was faint, as though it came from beneath the ice. My breath caught in my throat, and my chest felt tight. I looked down, pressing my gloved hands against the surface. For a split second, I thought I saw a face staring up at me. Its features were contorted, and its mouth seemed open in a silent cry. My blood went cold. I stumbled backward, almost slipping. The image vanished. My mind scrambled to make sense of it. I sprinted back to the shore, not daring to look behind me. My lungs burned from the cold air, and my legs felt shaky. When I reached the cabin, I slammed the door and locked it, though I wasn't sure what good that would do if something was truly under the ice. I paced around the living room, trying to get warm. My hands shook. I felt an urge to pack my things and leave immediately. But I'd already paid for the cabin, and a part of me wanted to believe there was a rational explanation. That night, I couldn't rest. I sat by the window with the lights off, watching the lake. It glowed faintly under the cloudy moonlight. Around midnight, I saw shadows again. They drifted near the edges, like figures pacing beneath the ice. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. I noticed movement near the center as well, slow shapes gliding under the surface. Every so often, I heard that cracking noise or a low moan. My breathing was shallow, and my forehead was damp with sweat. At one point, a shape seemed to tap against the ice, creating a dull thud that echoed across the lake. I fought the urge to scream. By the time morning came, I was done. My nerves were shot, and I felt like I hadn't slept in days. I shoved my clothes into my suitcase, tossed my food into a box, and loaded my car. My hands trembled as I grabbed the keys from the kitchen counter. I tried not to look at the lake as I walked outside, but I couldn't help a brief glance. The surface lay still under a pale sun, and it seemed completely ordinary. I turned away, started my car, and drove off, not caring if I left anything behind. As I pulled onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and caught a final glimpse of the cabin. The lake shimmered behind it. I felt a surge of relief when I realized I was putting distance between myself and that frozen water. My heart still pounded, and my breath felt shaky. I knew I wouldn't be returning. I wanted to forget everything about the place, especially the shapes that moved beneath the ice and the face I thought I saw looking up at me. For a while, I told no one about what happened. I felt embarrassed by how shaken I was. But the nightmares kept returning, images of hands pressing against a frozen surface, muffled screams echoing in the distance. I finally shared the experience with a close friend. She listened, eyes wide, then suggested it might have been stress or exhaustion. Maybe I imagined it, but I can't convince myself it was all in my head. I still remember the vibrations under my feet, the scream I heard, and that tortured face in the ice. I won't advise anyone to stay in that cabin during winter. I don't think it's safe, not for the mind at least. I've come to believe the lake holds remnants of people who drowned long ago, locked under the ice. Or maybe it's something else entirely. I don't have proof. All I have is the memory of my time in Whitefish, Montana, and the terrifying nights I spent listening to those moans beneath the frozen lake. Even now, recalling the moment I saw that face, I feel a shiver run through me. That's why I left, and never looked back. I grew up in a small town in rural Pennsylvania, not far from an old iron bridge that crosses a narrow river. People in the area always whispered that strange things happened there late at night. Drivers claimed their vehicles shook as they passed, as though something climbed on the metal beams and ran across the cables. I never gave it much thought until I started hearing the stories more often. Neighbors said a cold wind would blow through the bridge, even in mild weather, and sometimes they heard faint whispers under the structure. None of it sounded too real to me, but I was curious enough to check it out myself. One Saturday evening, I decided to take a closer look. I waited until around 11, hoping there wouldn't be much traffic. I drove along a dark 2-lane road surrounded by thick trees. The air felt stale in my car, and I couldn't shake a sense of unease. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was letting the rumors get into my head. The further I went, the fewer houses I saw. Eventually the road straightened out, and I spotted the bridge's outline ahead. Its iron framework stood against a moonlit sky, covered in patches of rust. The guardrails had chipped paint, and the road leading onto the bridge looked worn. I parked just before the entrance, on a small gravel shoulder. There were no other vehicles in sight. My headlights pointed toward the entrance, casting weird shadows on the beams. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the crickets outside. The wind picked up, and I felt a sudden chill despite the summer night. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched under my shoes. I felt a slight tremor in my stomach, wondering if this was a foolish idea. But I was determined to see if anything was there. I walked to the start of the bridge and looked at the river below. In the moonlight, I could see the water moving softly. It wasn't deep, but it was murky. The iron beams overhead formed a lattice that stretched across the narrow channel. The first few steps onto the metal surface felt normal. The structure rattled under my weight, but that was typical of old bridges. I shone my flashlight on the beams, noticing spots of corrosion and dark stains. At first, I thought it was just rust, but some patches looked more like smudged handprints or finger marks. I moved the beam of light in circles, trying to see the shape clearly. It was hard to tell, but the pattern made my skin crawl. As I walked deeper onto the bridge, I heard a low groaning sound. I paused and listened. Initially, I thought it might be the wind squeezing through the beams, but the noise shifted into something else, like a faint whisper mixed with metal creaking. My pulse quickened. I edged forward, pressing my palm against the cold railing to steady myself. The metal was colder than I expected for a summer night. I shivered, though the air around me didn't feel that chilly. Halfway across, I heard a distinct clang beneath my feet. It was as if someone stomped on the metal supports under the roadway. My heart hammered in my chest. I crouched, pointing my flashlight between the gaps. I saw nothing except layered steel. The clang happened again, followed by what sounded like footsteps on metal, moving away from me. Each step echoed in the silent night. I called out, "Hello?" but got no answer. The footsteps faded, replaced by the wind. I stood up, unsettled. My nerves were on edge, and my palms were sweating. I wiped them on my jeans and continued forward. I wanted to see the center of the bridge, to look down at the water from that vantage point. Another 30 feet or so, and I reached the midpoint. The rails on either side looked warped, with obvious signs of rust. The air felt colder here, almost clammy. I directed my flashlight along the sides, searching for any sign of movement. That's when I caught a glimpse of a pale hand gripping one of the lower beams. It vanished before I could focus the light properly. I stood there, stunned, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks on me. I flicked the beam back to the exact spot, but the hand was gone. My body tensed. I felt the urge to turn around and go back to my car, but a sense of curiosity mingled with the fear. I told myself to check one more time, so I leaned over the railing a bit and scanned the dark steel framework. I saw dripping water in a few spots, but no sign of a person or anything that resembled a human form. I started to wonder if a reflection or a stray shadow caused me to imagine things. Still, my heart wouldn't slow down. I decided I had seen enough for one night. The stories about this place suddenly felt more real than I cared to admit. I stepped back from the edge, intending to head for my car. Just then, I felt a sudden tug around my ankle. My foot jerked backward, and I almost fell on my knees. I swung my flashlight down, thinking I'd caught on a loose cable or some debris. But it looked like the metal part of a wire clamp was looped near my pant leg. I quickly kicked my foot free, my pulse racing. I had a fleeting thought that someone or something had grabbed me, but I saw no figure, no face, no movement, just that piece of loose cable scraping against the deck. My breathing was ragged. A deep sense of unease settled in my gut. I forced my legs to move, walking briskly toward the entrance. Each step echoed on the metal surface. I tried not to look down. The wind pushed against me, and I felt a sting of cold on my cheeks. After about 10 steps, I noticed the faint sound of breathing. It was soft, like someone inhaling and exhaling with difficulty. It came from behind me, or maybe below me. I couldn't pinpoint the source. The noise spurred me to move faster. When I finally reached the start of the bridge, I broke into a near run, my flashlight beam bouncing with each stride. I sprinted to my car, yanked the driver's door open, and jumped inside. My lungs burned from the sudden exertion. My hands fumbled with the keys. I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone behind my car, but I saw only the darkness and the faint outline of the iron structure. I turned the key. The engine choked but didn't start. My adrenaline spiked, and I muttered a curse under my breath. I tried again, but the engine coughed and died. Outside, the wind quieted, leaving only the hum of crickets and a faint metallic scraping. I felt sweat trickle down my temples. My chest tightened. I tried the ignition once more, pumping the gas slightly. On the third attempt, the engine roared to life. Relief flooded me. But before I could drive off, I heard a screech of metal against metal, like something sharp scraping my car's undercarriage near the front fender. The sound was loud enough to make me cringe. My headlights illuminated the area ahead, but there was nothing there. I slammed the gear into drive and hit the gas. Gravel flew behind me as I sped onto the road. My heart pounded. The scraping noise continued for a second or two, then stopped abruptly. As I drove away, I had the creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. I looked in the rearview mirror, convinced I'd see a shape clinging to the back of my vehicle. For a second, I thought I caught a flicker of movement. My breath seized. But when I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing. Just pitch-black night. I forced my eyes back to the road and kept driving until I was a couple of miles from the bridge. Only then did I slow down and take several deep breaths. When I got home, I felt disoriented. My hands were shaky as I set my keys on the kitchen table. I pulled out my phone and typed in some notes, trying to capture the details of what had just happened. It felt surreal, but the tension in my muscles reminded me it was real enough. Later, I inspected the front fender of my car and noticed fresh scrapes in the paint. I had no idea if I'd hit some hidden piece of metal on the bridge or if something else had caused them. Still, seeing those marks made my stomach churn. In the following days, I asked around discreetly. A few older residents mentioned a story about a bus full of prisoners that overturned on that bridge during a harsh winter many decades ago. Some prisoners drowned, others were trapped under the wreckage, and not all bodies were recovered. Rumor said their spirits roamed the iron beams at night, searching for a way out. I'm not one to jump at ghost tales, but it matched the eerie things I'd experienced. It explained the cold spots, the metallic scraping, and the sense that something was grabbing at my ankle. I haven't driven back there since. The old iron bridge still stands, and I'm sure people cross it during the day without issue. But at night, I'm convinced there's something off about it. Maybe the tragedies from the past left an imprint, or maybe the stories just fueled my imagination. Whatever the truth, the memory of that pale hand on the beam and that feeling of a cable wrapping around my leg still makes my heart race when I think about it. I've heard new rumors that if you stop your car on the bridge at midnight, you can hear tapping on the windows. Others claim they see shapes climbing the trusses in their peripheral vision. I have no intention of testing those rumors. For me, that one night was enough. I can't forget the chill in the air, the muffled footsteps under the road deck, and the sudden engine trouble that almost trapped me. It felt personal, like the place didn't want me to leave easily. Whenever a friend asks about local haunted spots, I warn them to avoid that stretch of road. I'm not sure they believe me. Some laugh it off, others get wide-eyed, but none have gone out there to prove me wrong. I'm okay with that. I'd rather keep that memory as a warning than see anyone else get stuck in that unnerving situation. Even now, Just recalling the sound of metal scraping under my car makes my pulse jump. That's my story. It's not dramatic in the way you see in movies, but it was enough to scare the hell out of me. The old iron bridge in rural Pennsylvania is more than a rusty structure. There's an unmistakable presence there, something that scrapes and whispers late at night. I felt it grab me, and I'm in no hurry to let that happen again. I arrived in Olympia on a late afternoon with overcast skies. I had heard about a secluded patch of private land called the Statue Forest. People told me it was once owned by a sculptor who left behind a series of stone figures scattered among thick trees. No one maintained the place after his death. I wanted to document these abandoned pieces of art. I hoped to find something unique, or at least have a decent record of an eccentric artist's output. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I felt a wave of unease as soon as I parked near the tree line. The access road was narrow and rutted. I drove slowly to avoid potholes and low branches. When I finally reached a clearing, I saw a rough trail leading deeper into the woods. I shut off my car's engine and stepped outside. The smell of damp leaves and rich soil filled the air. The sky was dim, but I guessed I had a couple of hours before it got too dark. I grabbed my camera and a small backpack with water, a flashlight, and basic supplies. I walked toward the trail, listening to the rustle of leaves under my boots. Not far in, I spotted the first statues. They were about shoulder high, carved to resemble serene faces. Moss grew around their edges, and some had chipped sections. The sculptor had placed them in open spots where small beams of light broke through the canopy. I took a few photos. There was nothing overtly unsettling about them, but I felt an odd tension in my chest as I moved from one figure to the next. The stillness was absolute, broken only by distant bird calls. I continued along the path, pausing every few steps to document each piece. The expressions on the statues changed gradually from calm to something else. One figure looked like it was caught in mid-sigh. Another had a slightly furrowed brow. It was subtle, but it made me uneasy. The trail narrowed, forcing me to brush branches aside. My camera strap got tangled in twigs once or twice. I pressed on, telling myself this was just an overgrown garden, nothing more. After about 20 minutes, a light fog crept over the ground. It wasn't thick at first, but it covered my ankles and made the forest look vague and colorless. I kept my flashlight in my backpack for now. I didn't want to pull it out prematurely. The air felt colder, and I zipped up my jacket. I tried to stay calm, focusing on the task. I took more photos, framing each statue carefully. Then I noticed a shift in their style. The faces became more distressed. One statue had wide eyes, as if it were startled by something. Another crouched with its arms partially extended, as though it were warding off an unseen threat. The artistry looked skilled, but I sensed a deeper unease in the air. I paused to examine footprints on the ground, though it was hard to make them out. It seemed like the soil had a few depressions, but I couldn't tell if they belonged to animals or people. My gut tightened. I told myself it was just the forest settling around me, that I was alone here. Still, the tension in my shoulders grew. Each time the wind picked up, it rustled leaves above my head, making me flinch. I pushed farther in. The statues stood closer together now. Some faced each other, while others pointed deeper into the forest. I took pictures of their twisted expressions. Their eyes and mouths appeared locked in silent fear. I felt my pulse quicken. Each shot I took felt like I was intruding on something personal. I tried to ignore that sensation. My job was to document them, that's all. At one point, I almost tripped over a stone arm jutting from the ground. It was part of a statue that had partially fallen or sunk into the earth. The arm reached out, as if it had been grasping for someone to pull it upright. I steadied myself, took a picture, and moved on, my heart pounding. The ground here was uneven, with shallow pits that might have been footprints or just random dips. I felt a chill run along my spine, even though the temperature hadn't changed much. I sensed I was being watched, but I saw no one. After a few more bends in the trail, the fog thickened. My view shrank to a few yards in any direction. The statues appeared more frequently and looked progressively terrified. One had its mouth wide open, stone lips parted in what could have been a scream. Another leaned forward with its hands on the ground, head tilted up, eyes carved in a look of desperation. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. I thought about turning around, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I told myself I just needed a few more photos, then I would head back. Eventually, I reached a small clearing. In the center stood a ring of statues arranged in a circle. They all faced a rock formation in the middle. Their faces were etched with panic. Their hands were lifted to shield their eyes. It felt like they were witnessing something horrifying. I approached carefully. My heart hammered in my chest, and my breathing grew shallow. I stepped between two figures to see what they were all looking at. There, in the center, was a large slab of stone with a half-finished sculpture on top. It had the rough shape of a hybrid creature, part man, part animal. The details weren't fully carved. I saw a horn, or maybe a twisted limb. The outline looked monstrous. My mouth went dry. I wanted to take a photo, but my hand trembled. My camera felt heavy around my neck. I forced myself to lift it and snap a shot. The flash momentarily illuminated the scene, making the statue's shadows dance across the fog. A bolt of fear shot through me. It looked like the figures shifted when the light flickered, but I told myself it was just a trick of shadows. As I stood there, the fog thickened even more, and the temperature dropped further. I heard a faint cracking sound. It reminded me of branches snapping or maybe stone shifting. My stomach tightened and sweat gathered on my palms. I checked behind me and saw only the circle of statues, yet I felt an urge to run. My instincts told me something wasn't right. I decided to leave. I carefully moved back the way I came, stepping around the ring of terrified sculptures. Once I was past them, I heard another noise, a scraping or grinding sound, like stone against stone. I paused and shone my flashlight around, but the beam reflected off thick fog. I couldn't see much. My heart raced. My head throbbed. I had the urge to drop everything and sprint, but I worried I'd trip on roots or run headlong into a tree, so I forced myself to keep a brisk but steady walk. Every few yards, I glanced back. I couldn't see the ring of statues anymore. The forest seemed darker. I hadn't realized how little daylight remained. I quickened my steps, hoping to find the path I came in on. I recognized some of the distressed statues I had passed before. Their expressions looked even more haunted in the dim light. I snapped one final photo out of reflex, but the camera flash lit up the statue's face in a shocking way, making me jump. I hurried on, focusing on not losing the trail. The wind picked up, rustling branches overhead and sending leaves swirling around my feet. I felt like the forest was closing in on me. My lungs hurt from shallow breathing. My legs ached. I kicked a fallen branch and nearly lost my balance. I grabbed onto a nearby tree trunk, scraping my palm on rough bark. My mind raced, urging me to keep moving, to get out of there. After several minutes, I finally spotted the edge of the tree line where I had parked. Relief washed over me. I jogged the last stretch, my breath ragged. When I reached my car, I fumbled for the keys in my pocket. I unlocked the door and threw my backpack onto the passenger seat. Then I climbed in and slammed the door shut. My hands shook as I started the engine. I glanced back at the forest one more time. Nothing moved, but I still felt eyes on me. I drove away, feeling a knot in my stomach. My entire body was tense. My mind replayed the sight of those statues, their fear captured in stone. I also couldn't forget that half-finished creature in the center, or the odd noises I heard. It took me a while to calm down. By the time I reached a populated area, night had fully fallen, and my nerves were raw. I pulled over at a gas station, turned off the car, and just sat there trying to steady my breathing. When I got home later, I copied the photos from my camera to my computer. As I looked through them, I noticed something strange. Some statues seemed to be in slightly different positions between shots. I tried to rationalize that it could be my angles or the lighting, but one or two images made no sense. A statue's arm appeared raised in a later shot when it was lowered in the earlier one. I told myself maybe I had just photographed different statues that looked similar. Still, it unsettled me. I considered going back to verify my findings, but decided against it. I didn't want to walk through that forest again. The memory of that final clearing with the ring of terrified figures stayed with me. I wondered what the sculptor had been trying to depict. I wondered if the incomplete creature in the center was supposed to be a final masterpiece or something else. I tried to push it out of my mind. I spent the next few days writing up my notes, labeling my photos, and storing them in a private folder. I didn't share them publicly. Something about that place felt like it needed to remain undisturbed. I heard rumors that the land had been sold to a developer, but the deal fell through. Nobody wanted the liability of those crumbling statues and the weird feeling the forest gave off. Sometimes I think about the caretaker or the family members who once owned that land. Did they ever walk among those statues at night? Did they hear the same sounds I did, or see the same strange movements? I don't have an answer. All I know is that I experienced something in that wooded area that goes beyond typical art installations. The tension in the air was too strong, and the expressions on those stone faces were too vivid. I don't plan to return. Even now, recalling the ring of statues pointing at that monstrous shape is enough to make my stomach tighten. That's the whole story. I went there expecting to document neglected sculptures. Instead, I left with images that still unsettle me when I look at them. I don't have an explanation for the weird shifts between photos or the noises I heard in the fog. Maybe the sculptor's energy lingers. Maybe it's all in my head. Either way, I'm staying away. The statue forest in Olympia is not a place I'd recommend to anyone who values a good night's sleep. I saw enough to convince me some art is better left alone. I first learned about the old puppet theater from an acquaintance who knew I liked unusual performing arts venues. She told me there was a small abandoned place in an older part of Fort Worth, not far from some shuttered warehouses. She claimed it used to host puppet shows decades ago, but now it stood locked and forgotten. I felt intrigued and uneasy at the same time. Still, I wanted to see it for myself. I had a habit of checking out old theaters and collecting photos of their stages, props, and backstage spaces. This puppet theater felt like the perfect next stop. When I arrived, the neighborhood felt deserted. Some of the nearby buildings had broken windows, boarded-up entrances, and graffiti splashed across brick walls. The sky was overcast, making the atmosphere gray. I parked on the street and walked a short distance to the structure. It appeared more like a large shed than a theater. Plain walls, a simple roof, and a side door with a heavy padlock. The front, if there had ever been one, had a collapsed awning and a small sign I couldn't read anymore. I checked the side door. The padlock looked rusty, and I noticed the hasp was loose. The wood around it was rotted enough that a firm pull might do the job. I took a quick look around, worried someone might see me, but there wasn't a single person in sight. I yanked on the door, and the hasp tore free with a cracking sound. The door creaked open. A rush of musty air hit my face. It smelled like damp wood, dust, and something stale. My stomach tensed, but I stepped inside anyway. My flashlight beam swept across the space. At first, I saw piles of old scenery flats stacked along the walls, bits of costume fabric, broken chairs, and a battered wooden stage in the center. The stage was small, maybe meant for a single puppeteer to stand behind a curtain while the audience viewed marionettes at eye level. Faded red drapes hung in tatters at each side. The place was silent. My footsteps echoed on the concrete floor. I shone my flashlight around, taking note of everything. I spotted boxes with labels like Character A or Prince Puppet scrawled in faded ink. I felt a slight chill on my arms, even though the temperature outside was warm. I approached the stage and noticed the boards were warped. A few random set pieces leaned against the back wall. I stepped up, my boots thudding on the old planks. I saw spider webs clinging to corners. Then I spotted a large wooden crate near the stage's center, marked with bold letters, Harlequin. That piqued my interest, so I knelt and lifted the lid. Inside, I found a single puppet with blue painted eyes, dressed in a worn outfit. Its strings were tangled, but the limbs felt surprisingly flexible. I turned the puppet in my hands, examining the craftsmanship. The paint job looked detailed, especially around the eyes. The figure's gaze appeared fixed on me. A spike of discomfort ran through my chest as though I was holding something that could look back at me. I had seen puppets before, but something about this one made me uneasy. I set it down carefully and let out a slow breath. I heard a faint scraping sound behind me. It was light, like strings dragging across the floor. I pivoted, shining my flashlight around, but only saw more dusty boxes and a few toppled chairs. I listened, holding my breath. The noise stopped. My heart thumped in my ears. I stood there for a few seconds, uncertain if I should keep exploring or head out. My curiosity nudged me forward. I moved toward the back of the building, where a cluster of marionettes hung from an overhead rail. They dangled by their strings, their painted faces set in static expressions. When I lifted my flashlight, I saw that some had half-open mouths, as if they were caught mid-speech. Others had blank stares or exaggerated smiles. A few of the strings were knotted and twisted, giving the puppets an odd tilt. Seeing them in the flashlight's beam made the hair on my neck stand on end. I couldn't tell why. They were just wooden figures. But something about them felt off, like they might move at any second. As I studied them, a metallic jingle came from the floor near my feet. It sounded like a small ring or hook dragging on concrete. I froze, crouching to see if an animal was scurrying around. Before I could look properly, I felt a slight tug on my ankle. I jerked my foot back and swung the flashlight down. A puppet lay near my boot. Its painted eyes stared up at me. I let out a startled cry, stumbling backward. My pulse pounded in my throat. I knew I hadn't touched it. The puppet had been on a shelf a moment earlier. How did it get to the floor so close to me? I took a few steps back and tried to calm my breathing. My thoughts raced. Did I accidentally knock it over? Was there a slope on the floor? While I tried to rationalize, I noticed the puppet's arm was raised slightly, as though it had reached for my leg. My stomach twisted. I knew it couldn't have moved on its own, but that arm's position made my skin crawl. I started to back away, intending to leave. Then, overhead, the rails and wires began to sway. The marionettes hanging there bumped into each other, producing a rustling, clicking sound. It reminded me of bones rattling together, which made it worse. I spun around, heading for the door. My flashlight beam wavered on boxes and old set pieces, casting jittery shadows on the walls. I passed the stage and collided with a support stand. It toppled onto me, and I nearly fell over. Wood clattered to the floor, and dust kicked up, getting into my nose and eyes. I struggled to keep my balance, my heart hammered in my chest. Through the dust, I glimpsed a puppet on the stage. It looked like it shifted slightly, one hand pointing at me. My throat went dry. I pushed the stand aside and forced myself to get to the exit. My own footfalls sounded too loud in the echoing space. I half expected to feel strings tangling around my arms or something grabbing my shoulder. Each second felt stretched and tense. Once I reached the side door, I shoved it open with my shoulder. It made a scraping noise against the concrete threshold. I stumbled outside into the gray daylight, breathing hard. My legs trembled, and sweat clung to the back of my neck. I slammed the door shut behind me, though it didn't lock. I hurried to my car and threw my backpack into the passenger seat, my mind spinning with confusion and fear. I sat there for a minute, engine idling, trying to steady my hands. Thoughts ran wild in my head. I asked myself if I had hallucinated or if the old building's environment had gotten to me. I had a pounding headache, probably from tension. Finally, I drove away, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see that place receding behind me. I wanted to leave it in the past as quickly as I could. Over the next few days, I found myself unable to shake the memory. I kept picturing those puppets hanging in the dusty gloom, their expressions stuck between life and emptiness. I remembered the one that ended up near my foot, the way its arm lifted. I had nightmares of strings looping around my wrists, forcing me to move like a puppet. I woke up sweating, my body tensed in panic. I tried telling a friend about what happened, but she looked doubtful, as if I was exaggerating. Maybe I was, or maybe she just didn't want to imagine it. I decided to dig up more information about that little theater. I searched local archives and found old newspaper clippings. The place had been owned by a puppeteer who disappeared under strange circumstances. The last mention of him was from the early 1980s. His name was listed in a missing persons report, but the file had no resolution. Some people speculated he moved away or met with an accident. Others whispered that he became obsessed with his marionettes and lost his grip on reality. Reading those articles made my chest tighten. I pictured him walking alone on that warped stage, surrounded by silent puppets. One rumor mentioned the puppets might be cursed, though the article never explained how that rumor started. I didn't believe in curses. I still don't. But there was no doubt in my mind that something felt deeply wrong about that building. It wasn't just the broken wood or the dust or the darkness. The place felt charged with a presence. It was the sensation of being watched, the sense that I wasn't alone, even though nobody else was visible. I haven't gone back. Sometimes I still think about returning to see if I imagined it all, but my instincts tell me I wouldn't find an easy explanation. I can't erase the memory of that puppet pulling itself across the floor, or the way the overhead wires started to move without a breeze in the room. I have plenty of other theaters to explore. I don't need to revisit the one that left me shaken. I still do photography work, capturing images of old stages, but I haven't posted the pictures I took in that building. There aren't many anyway. Most are either too dark or blurry. Part of me wonders if the camera might have caught something in the background, a puppet's limb mid-movement. But I can't bring myself to look closely. Every time I open the folder on my computer, I feel a pang of dread. The few pictures I have show dusty floors, tangled strings, and the corner of that battered stage. Nothing more. Some nights, I dream I'm back in that building. The stage curtains sway even though there's no wind. The marionettes shift on their hooks and turn their heads to stare at me. In those dreams, I feel strings wrap around my arms and chest. I try to scream, but my mouth won't open. Then I jerk awake, struggling to breathe. It takes me a long time to fall asleep again. A few weeks after my visit, I heard a rumor that a group of teenagers had broken in on a dare. One of them apparently left in tears, claiming she saw a puppet moving on its own. That story didn't appear in any newspaper, but I overheard it at a local coffee shop. I never approached them to ask for details, but it confirmed I wasn't the only one who felt something sinister in there. Now, when people ask about interesting places in Fort Worth, I avoid mentioning that puppet theater. I'll talk about museums, concert halls, or the big performing arts centers. Sometimes they push for hidden gems, but I keep my mouth shut. I'd rather not direct anyone to that dusty building. I don't think it's safe, at least not for anyone who's sensitive to strange occurrences. Let it stay forgotten. In the end, I remember that moment when I first opened the door. The stale air, the darkness, the smell of old wood and dust. At the time I thought it was just another neglected property. But the presence behind those curtains was different. It felt active, aware, and unsettling. I can't prove what I experienced, and some might say it was just my imagination. But the physical sensations, the tug on my ankle, the rattling of the overhead strings, those were too real for me to dismiss. That's all I know. I never saw the owner, and I don't plan on investigating his fate any further. I'm content to let the rumor stand that he vanished and left behind a collection of puppets that don't want to stay still. Even now, if I drive in that part of town, I feel my palms sweat on the steering wheel. I make sure to take a different route so I don't have to pass that building. It's better that way. My last memory is enough to remind me that some places are better left locked up. The echo of shifting marionettes and that subtle pull on my leg is all the proof I need that something in there isn't right. It can stay where it is, behind that broken door. I first heard the stories about the voices on the dam from local fishermen. They said the water spoke at dusk, that murmurs rose from beneath the surface when the sun began to slip behind the trees. I was skeptical. My name is Raymond, and I work as a biologist. I was assigned to study water quality and fish populations in the area near Shreveport. I thought the rumors were just local folklore. I wanted concrete data, so I scheduled a few days to sample the water and observe the area. I didn't expect anything unusual. I planned to take some tests, collect samples, and leave. I arrived with my small boat on a mild afternoon, the sky slightly overcast, and the temperature warm enough to discourage wearing heavy layers. On my first afternoon, I followed my routine. I anchored the boat in 3 different spots near the center of the reservoir, took water samples, and documented everything in my log. I measured pH levels, checked oxygen content, and recorded fish activity. The dam looked quiet and unremarkable. It was an old structure built in the 1930s. I noted a few cracks in the concrete, some rusted metal supports, but nothing out of the ordinary. The surrounding forest was dense, tall pines and a thick underbrush pressed close to the water's edge. The atmosphere felt calm and still. Once my work was done, I realized it was already late. The sun dipped below the treetops, and dusk settled in fast. I was still drifting in the center of the reservoir. The surface of the water rippled gently. I thought about heading back to shore right away, but I decided to wait a bit longer. I had a minor curiosity about the rumors I had heard. I figured I might as well listen for a few minutes. If there were no sounds, I would leave. I switched off the motor of my small boat. The place went silent except for the soft slosh of water against the hull. My eyes scanned the shoreline. Through the haze of twilight, I saw no sign of other people. The sky turned a deep orange, and the first stars flickered overhead. I adjusted my position and leaned forward, straining to hear anything besides natural water movement. For a few minutes, I heard nothing except gentle waves. Then I caught a faint hum. It sounded like low voices, not distinct words, but more like a distant conversation happening behind a closed door. My pulse quickened. It was so soft that I wondered if it might be the wind brushing through the trees. But there was no breeze that evening. I stayed still, focusing on the faint murmurs. They rose and fell in pitch, as though multiple people were talking at the same time. I tried to discern words, but I couldn't. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be echoing from somewhere on shore? Could there be campers or hikers nearby? But the forest looked empty. Suddenly, there was a short, sharp whistle. It shot through the air and made me jump. I spun around, scanning the dark surface of the water, but saw only scattered ripples. The voices, if that's what they were, grew quieter. That was my first night. I left shortly after that whistle. My nerves felt rattled. My head buzzed with questions, and my chest felt tight. I told myself it had to be a trick of acoustics or some random phenomenon I hadn't encountered before. I slept poorly that night, thinking about it. The next morning, I analyzed my samples in a temporary lab space I had set up. The results showed normal chemical balances. There was nothing special about the water itself. I also checked local maps, trying to see if there was any large settlement or campsite near the dam. There wasn't. I felt more curious now. I wanted a rational explanation, but I also felt a gnawing anxiety. The second night, I returned to the dam area. I wanted to do a more systematic approach. I brought a simple digital audio recorder. I anchored my boat again at twilight and repeated the process. I turned off the engine, sat in silence, and waited. The environment got dark. A layer of fog drifted across the water, illuminated faintly by moonlight. The temperature dropped, and I felt the chill through my jacket. For a while, I heard nothing but the lapping of water. Then, the same low voices emerged, like a hushed conversation. This time, I hit record on my device, hoping to capture the sound. The voices grew slightly louder, but they still seemed muffled. I couldn't tell if they were speaking English or any other language. It was more like emotional murmurs, as though people were sad or worried. My hands were cold, and my breath turned shallow. I tried to remind myself I was a scientist collecting data. Still, I felt unsettled. A moment later, there was another short whistle. It echoed across the water. The surface near my boat began to bubble lightly, as if air was rising from beneath. I leaned over the edge with a flashlight, trying to see anything below. There was only murky darkness. The voices persisted. They wove in and out, like a soft chant. I felt my scalp prickle. Then I saw a faint shape move under the water. It disappeared before I could focus my flashlight on it. My pulse pounded. I cranked the engine, maneuvering back toward shore. When I reached the bank, I turned off the boat and jumped onto solid ground. My legs felt unsteady. I carried my audio recorder in one hand, gear in the other. I could still hear the low voices drifting across the reservoir, but they were weaker. Once I loaded my equipment in my vehicle, I listened to a bit of the recording. To my surprise, it only captured water sounds and the occasional hum of insects. I heard nothing that resembled the voices. That made me uneasy. It suggested that maybe the sounds weren't typical noises at all, or that they existed in a range the recorder couldn't detect. I decided to stay in town another day. I wanted more information. The next morning, I spoke to a local historian at a small museum in Shreveport. She told me that the dam had been constructed over an old settlement. The reservoir flooded the area, and not everyone's remains were moved. She mentioned rumors of families who had lived near the water's edge and refused to leave when the construction began. Eventually, the rising water forced them out, but the official records showed several missing individuals who were never found. Some people claimed their spirits stayed beneath the surface. It was a story I would normally dismiss, but after what I heard, I started to wonder. That afternoon, I returned to the dam. I felt nervous, but determined to gather more evidence. I set up a second recorder on the shoreline, away from any engine noise, while I took the boat out again. I wanted 2 audio sources to compare. The water was calm, and the weather was clear. As the sun went down, I sat in silence. The voices started again. It felt like they were closer this time. I couldn't pinpoint a direction. They surrounded me like a ring of soft whispers. The temperature dropped, and a slight breeze carried an unsettling dampness. After a few minutes, the voices became clearer. I thought I heard phrases like, "We're still here," or "We can't leave." My heart raced, and my breath came in short bursts. My eyes scanned the dark water. Then, without warning, a dense fog rolled in from the far side of the reservoir. It drifted across the surface, and I struggled to see more than a few feet. Shadows flickered near the edges of my vision. I thought I saw human-like figures, transparent, dressed in old-style clothing. They floated above the water, their faces solemn. My muscles tightened, and I felt rooted to my seat. A shiver ran up my spine. My mouth was dry, and I barely swallowed. The figures moved in and out of the fog. Their images flickered like a weak signal on a screen. I felt a fierce urge to leave, but my curiosity held me for a moment longer. One figure turned its head in my direction, and I saw an expression of sorrow. I nearly dropped my flashlight. I felt a strong wave of dread. I couldn't stand it anymore. I fired up the engine and headed back to shore as fast as I could, without risking a collision in the fog. When I got back on land, I ran to my car. My heart pounded and my chest felt tight. I glanced at the second recorder I had left on the shore. Its red light indicated it was still running. Once I calmed down, I gathered the recorder and drove off. My nerves were shot. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something following me. The road was empty, and the night sky offered no comfort. That night, I played both recordings on my laptop in my motel room. I heard no voices, only the soft lapping of water and the occasional breeze. I rewound the files again and again, convinced I might find something if I listened closely. But there was nothing. My memory of what I heard was too vivid to dismiss. The absence of any audio evidence made me feel paranoid. I realized that all my training in biology and environmental science gave me no explanation for these sounds. I didn't return to the dam. I finished my standard water analysis the next day, using the samples I had already collected. Everything was within normal ranges. The fish population data was consistent with other lakes in the region. On the surface, the reservoir was entirely ordinary. But I couldn't ignore the strange whispers and the images I'd seen in the fog. I told myself I would file my official report and recommend further testing for any possible gas emissions or acoustic anomalies. Yet deep down, I suspected no amount of conventional research would explain this. On my last evening in town, I spoke to another local fisherman at a diner. He claimed that on misty nights, you could hear a whole town talking beneath the water. He said he once saw lantern lights moving just below the surface. I told him about my experiences, and he nodded as if he'd expected it. That unsettled me. It made me feel that my experiences weren't isolated. Other people had heard the dam's voices too, even if nobody could record them. When I left Shreveport, I felt relieved to put distance between me and that reservoir. In the weeks after, my dreams were filled with faint murmurs and drifting shapes. I had nightmares of falling into that water, hearing muffled screams all around me. I tried to bury those images by focusing on new projects. But whenever I see a photograph of that dam, my stomach tightens. I can't forget the low voices, the whistle, the shapes in the fog. They seem to demand attention, as if they wanted someone to acknowledge their presence. I don't think I'll ever feel comfortable going back. I believe there are places where past events linger in ways we can't measure with normal tools. I don't share that idea in my scientific papers because I have nothing to substantiate it. But my own senses tell me I heard something real. I saw those silhouettes, and I remember the sense of sorrow that filled the air. If anyone asks me about the dam near Shreveport, I tell them to approach it with caution after dusk. That's all I can say. I still can't explain it, and I don't know if anyone ever will. I just know I heard people speaking, and I saw shadows in the mist, and I have no desire to experience that again. I arrived at the old house on a cloudy morning. The building stood in a quiet neighborhood of Baltimore, surrounded by tall oaks and cracked sidewalks. The outside walls looked grimy, and most of the windows were boarded up. My task was to inspect the place and see if it was worth buying. I had worked with real estate for years, so I was used to old properties. I felt a little anxious because the house had been abandoned for a long time, but I assumed I would only face dust and maybe a few rodents. As soon as I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something odd. The main door was slightly ajar, but there was a chain lock hanging broken from the frame. I pushed the door carefully, and it creaked loud enough to set my nerves on edge. The foyer was dim, even though some light trickled in through narrow gaps in the boarded-up windows. The air felt stale, with a strange smell I couldn't identify. It reminded me of old roses and rotting wood. I walked forward, scanning every corner for any signs of structural damage or squatters. The floor under my feet groaned. I switched on my flashlight for extra clarity. Dust motes floated in the beam. I was used to that musty atmosphere, but something about the silence bothered me. I took a few more steps and saw several closed doors leading to different rooms. I had a printed floor plan, so I tried to match each door with the plan in my hand. I quickly realized nothing lined up. There were doors where the plan showed walls, and one corridor that didn't appear on the blueprint at all. At first I thought maybe I had an outdated floor plan, or that prior owners had renovated the place. Then I noticed that one of the walls felt hollow. I tapped on it, and the sound was different from a normal thick plaster wall. I knelt and saw there were nails hammered into wooden boards, but it didn't look like a standard construction job. It looked more like someone had sealed off an area. I decided to pull at a loose board. It gave way, revealing a dark gap. My pulse jumped. I leaned closer, shining my flashlight inside. The gap looked wide enough to walk through. I felt a wave of hesitation, but my curiosity drove me forward. I pushed aside more boards until I cleared enough space to enter. Behind that barrier was a small door. It had a simple knob covered in dust. I tried it, and it opened with a dull click. I aimed my flashlight into the room and saw miniature furniture arranged around the floor, tiny chairs, a little table, and even a small piano. Each piece was carefully made to be a scaled-down version of real furniture, but the dimensions were odd. They seemed child-sized, yet not exactly the size of a standard dollhouse. The entire arrangement sat in a room that smelled like roses, but I couldn't see any actual flowers. The smell was faint but persistent. I stepped inside, making sure the floor was stable. The walls were bare, and there was no trash or debris. The room didn't even have a thick layer of dust. It looked as though someone had been maintaining it. I felt a chill. My thoughts raced as I wondered who had been in this hidden area. I walked around the miniature furniture. The details were unsettling. The tiny piano had keys carved out of some material I couldn't identify. The chairs had worn upholstery, as if they had been used. In the corner, I spotted an old journal. Its leather cover felt smooth. Most of its pages were blank, but I flipped to the last one and saw one sentence scrawled in thick ink. "They live here, in the walls." I felt my heart thump. My flashlight wavered in my hand. The note sounded crazy, but the words stuck in my mind. I checked behind me, half expecting someone to be lurking in the corridor. I saw nothing, but the hair on my arms stood up. I decided to keep moving. The floor plan I had was useless now, so I relied on my sense of direction. I slipped back into the hallway and continued deeper into the house. As I moved, I heard soft scraping noises from behind the walls. At first, I told myself it was just rats or the building settling. I tried to ignore it, but each time I stopped walking, the noise stopped too. When I resumed, it would pick up again. My chest felt tight, and I had trouble taking full breaths. I came across another hidden door after noticing a seam in the paneling. It led to a larger space with bookshelves and old toys. The shelves contained children's books with faded covers. Some were stacked sideways, others lined up neatly. I saw battered teddy bears and tiny figures that looked handmade. The musty rose scent was stronger. My eyes stung, but I couldn't tell if it was from dust or nerves. I moved the flashlight around, trying to see if there were any recent footprints in the dust. I found small tracks, but they were odd. They looked like a child's footprints, but the toes were reversed. The heel was at the front, and the toes at the back. I felt my stomach knot. I stared at those footprints for a while, my heart pounding. Then my flashlight flickered. Its beam dimmed, then blinked out. I smacked it a few times, cursing under my breath. Finally it turned back on, but only faintly. That was when I heard giggles. They sounded like children giggling, but distant and somehow wrong. It made my skin crawl. I spun around, shining the weak light across the shelves and the walls, but I couldn't see anyone. The giggles faded into whispers. I backed up toward the door, thinking I should leave this place. My mind ran through excuses to stop the inspection. Just then, I heard a scuffing noise right behind me. I whirled around and caught a glimpse of a tiny figure darting behind a shelf. It moved low to the ground. I only saw it for a second. My body froze, and my breath came in ragged gasps. Part of me wanted to chase after it, just to confirm I wasn't hallucinating. Another part wanted to bolt. I chose to go after it, though my hands shook. I stepped around the shelf and found a blank section of wall. The figure was gone. No sign of a door or a crack large enough for a person to fit through. I pressed on the boards, but they felt solid. My palms felt clammy. I realized I had my phone, so I tried to call someone for backup. The signal was weak. I only got static. Frustrated, I stepped back into the hallway. I decided I would head toward the main entrance and call the whole thing off. As I navigated back, I discovered that the door I had used to enter the hidden rooms was jammed. It wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I pushed. I rattled the knob and leaned my shoulder into it. It felt like something heavy was on the other side. Then I heard laughter again, but this time it sounded louder, like multiple children giggling close by. Their laughter turned into a mocking chorus. I felt a wave of panic. My legs felt weak. My mouth went dry. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I spun around and ran down a narrow hallway, hoping to find another exit. The hallway branched in two directions. I chose the left path and found a wooden staircase leading down. Each step creaked under my weight. The further down I went, the darker it got. My flashlight flickered again. My breath was shallow, and my mind jumped between panic and the urge to keep going. I reached a bottom level that opened into an old basement area. I saw broken crates, random junk, and a door that led, I hoped, outside. When I tried that door, I discovered it was locked from the outside. I pounded on it a few times, my fists making dull thuds. Then I heard small footsteps behind me. My stomach clenched. I refused to turn around right away because I was so scared. When I finally did, my flashlight beam fell on a small shape. It darted away so fast I barely registered it. It disappeared behind a stack of boxes. My breathing was ragged and my eyes watered from strain. I felt cornered. I moved back upstairs, deciding to force open any door leading outside, even if I had to break a window. On my way up, I heard a soft voice humming. It sounded like a lullaby. I paused, gripping the railing. My heart thumped against my ribs. The humming stopped suddenly. Silence pressed in. I reached the main floor and saw a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. A small figure slid into a space in the wall. I got a brief look at a pale face and dark eyes. Then it vanished into a gap I couldn't see properly. I tried door after door. Most were locked or blocked. My panic grew. The entire house felt like it was shifting around me, revealing hidden corners and passages. Each time I blinked, I saw fleeting shapes, child-sized, slipping through cracks. My flashlight grew weaker. It barely lit the floor in front of me. I forced myself to calm down, to think logically. I needed a plan. I looked for the foyer or any window I could break. After stumbling around a few turns, I finally spotted the front hallway. I rushed to the main door, which was now stuck. I pulled at the handle until I felt a jolt in my shoulder. I twisted and yanked as hard as I could. The door opened with a snap of wood. I stumbled forward, almost losing my balance. I could still hear faint giggles in the back of my mind, but now I was outside on the porch. I sucked in fresh air, almost choking on relief. My hands shook so badly that I dropped my flashlight on the porch steps. I backed away from the doorway, never taking my eyes off the dark interior. I expected to see faces peeking out at me, but I only saw shadows. The house remained silent. The faint smell of roses clung to my clothes. I felt a slight breeze on my neck and realized I was sweating. My throat was parched, and my entire body felt on edge. I walked down the steps and crossed the overgrown yard. I reached the sidewalk, breathing heavily, feeling the tension in my neck and shoulders. My mind raced with questions. I remembered the journal that said, "They live here, in the walls." I remembered the miniature furniture and the footprints with reversed toes. The giggles and the fleeting shapes weighed on me. None of it felt normal. I climbed into my car and locked the doors. My heart pounded as I started the engine. I drove away, glancing back at the mansion. Its windows seemed blank and lifeless, but I imagined small eyes watching me through cracks. Once I was a few blocks away, I parked on the side of the road. My hands gripped the steering wheel. I felt a swell of nausea. I knew I wouldn't pursue the property any further. I didn't care about the potential profit. The place felt wrong, and I had no intention of returning. Over the next few days, I heard rumors about the mansion's history. Some people said children had disappeared there long ago. Others said a strange family once lived there, obsessed with building secret compartments. I had no way to confirm the stories, but I was certain that something or someone occupied those hidden rooms. The memory of those footprints and the laughter stayed with me. I decided to forget about the mansion and move on with my work. I avoided telling potential buyers about what I had experienced. I didn't want to be ridiculed, and I didn't want them thinking I was unprofessional. But I did warn one colleague never to visit that property alone. I told her it was unsafe and that it wasn't worth the trouble. She gave me a strange look, but agreed. Even now, I sometimes dream about the miniature furniture and the child-sized footprints. I see them in my mind, reversed heels and toes pressed into the dust. In those dreams, I hear kids giggling. Then I wake up with my heart racing. I have no desire to go back. The memory of that stale rose smell and those hidden passages is enough to keep me away. I still hold the final page of that journal in my thoughts. They live here, in the walls. I can't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever lives there is always waiting. I arrived in Bar Harbor before sunrise. I wanted photos of the coast with the morning fog, so I drove along narrow roads until I reached a small cove. There I saw an old lighthouse. It stood on a cluster of slippery rocks that pushed out into the water. Its tower looked solid, but the light at the top was dead. It hadn't shone in decades. I could see broken windows along its side and an open door at its base. I parked on a patch of uneven ground near the shore. I checked the tide chart on my phone. Low tide was in effect for a short window, so I had enough time to walk across the rocks. I grabbed my camera gear, slung my backpack on, and moved out. The ground was slick. My boots slipped on patches of seaweed. The air smelled like salt. I felt a cold breeze that brushed against my face, raising goosebumps on my arms. Once I reached the lighthouse, I paused to look back at my car. It appeared small against the rocky shoreline. I wondered if I should hurry and take a few photos outside, then leave. But the open door drew my attention. It swayed on rusty hinges, creaking each time the wind blew. I decided to step inside. I saw no fences or warning signs. My curiosity overrode my caution. Inside, I caught the scent of salt and mold. The interior was dim, even though the morning light filtered through cracks in the walls. I kept my camera ready, in case I found anything interesting to shoot. The floor was damp. My footsteps sounded loud against the worn concrete. I saw fragments of broken glass in corners and pieces of rope coiled near a wall. Everything felt abandoned, yet it didn't feel empty. I looked up a narrow staircase that spiraled toward the top. I hesitated. The place felt wrong, but I told myself I was only nervous because the structure was old and in bad shape. My chest felt tight, but I forced myself to climb. My boots made dull thuds on each step. The spiral was narrow, and the railing felt rough. My hand brushed flakes of rust as I ascended. Halfway up, I paused to catch my breath. While standing there, I heard footsteps above me. They sounded faint at first, like someone shifting their weight on old boards. Then I heard a distinct creak. My pulse accelerated. My mouth went dry. I told myself it was just the wind or the building settling. But the noise continued, one step after another, in a slow, deliberate pattern. I called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed, but there was no answer. I felt my stomach clench. I continued my climb with my breath shallow and quick. My legs felt tight. I kept the camera strap around my neck in case I needed both hands. The higher I went, the darker it seemed to get. I knew there should be more light coming through the top, but it wasn't there. My boots scuffed the steps, and I tried to keep them quiet. I didn't want to announce my presence, although it might have already been too late. When I reached the top, I entered the lantern room. It was supposed to be where the light apparatus stood, but the large glass windows were in bad shape. One of them was shattered completely. A segment of the lens lay rusted in place, while the rest had collapsed into a messy pile on the floor. I aimed my flashlight around. Dust swirled in the beam, and I noticed the old gears that had once powered the lamp. They looked corroded beyond repair. The air felt cold. That didn't make sense, because there were no open windows big enough for a strong draft, except for the broken pane. Yet the breeze seemed to come from inside the room. I shivered. My heart pounded. I heard a scraping sound near the gears. I directed my flashlight in that direction and saw a dark figure. It wore what looked like an old-fashioned coat, the kind that might belong to a lighthouse keeper. Its form was mostly in shadow, but the coat's collar stood out, stiff against its neck. My breath caught in my throat. My chest felt crushed by panic. I couldn't move. The figure lifted an arm slowly, pointing toward the sea. My eyes tracked the motion of that arm. I forced myself to look out through the broken window. In that moment, the figure vanished. There was no slow fade. It was there, then gone. I spun around, shining the flashlight everywhere, but found nothing. My hands shook. I glanced outside and realized the tide was coming in. The rocks I had crossed were now submerged. The water rose quickly in this area, and I knew I could get stuck if I waited too long. I heard a metallic creaking behind me. It sounded like chains or cogs shifting into place. I wheeled around to see the old machinery vibrating. It gave off a faint groan. The motion felt unnatural. I bolted for the stairs. My legs felt weak, and I gripped the railing so hard my knuckles went white. Each step down felt longer than the last. My ears picked up the sound of old metal grinding, as if the mechanism upstairs was trying to start again. Adrenaline surged in me, forcing me to hurry. My thoughts were jumbled. I needed to escape before the water trapped me on the island of rock. As I reached the base of the stairs, I heard a loud clang. I jumped, slamming my shoulder into the doorway. Pain shot down my arm. I gritted my teeth and pushed forward. The next few seconds were a blur. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, and my breath came in short bursts. I could taste salt on my lips. I sprinted through the main door, nearly stumbling over a chunk of concrete near the threshold. Outside, the rocks were slippery. Waves crashed around them, sending cold spray up to my ankles. The water was already high. I could see large sections of the path submerged. My mind raced. I feared that in a few minutes I wouldn't be able to cross. I hopped from rock to rock, feeling the ocean surge around me. Each step threatened to throw me off balance. My camera banged against my chest. I was too scared to protect it. I just needed to get back to shore. When I reached land, I leaned against a boulder to catch my breath. My lungs burned and my legs ached. I turned around to look at the lighthouse. In the distance, the tower appeared dark again. I squinted, focusing on the top level. For a few seconds, I thought I saw a flicker of light there. It flashed once, then went out. I felt my stomach churn with anxiety and confusion. My brain told me it was impossible. That light had been dead for decades. Back at my car, I dropped my gear in the back seat and slammed the door. My hands fumbled for the keys. I kept glancing at the lighthouse while I tried to start the engine. My heart was still racing. Finally, the engine turned over. I pulled away from the edge of the water, my eyes darting toward the rear-view mirror. The structure faded from view, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. I drove until I reached a rest area near the highway. I parked and sat there, trying to slow my breathing. My clothes felt damp, and my feet were cold from the water. My fingers trembled on the steering wheel. In that moment, I started to process what I had just experienced. Every muscle in my body felt tense. I didn't want to believe in ghosts or lost spirits, but what I saw was hard to dismiss. Later, I looked at the photos I had taken outside the lighthouse. They were bland shots, mostly just the building with the early morning haze. But I noticed something in one of them, a strange shadow in a top window, shaped like a figure near the broken glass. I shut off my camera and tried not to think about it. Still, every time I remembered the feeling of that cold breeze or the sight of that figure pointing out to sea, I felt a deep chill in my core. I told a friend about it a few days later. She asked if I got any good shots of the interior. I explained I never had the chance. I felt uneasy describing the event. My friend told me that some local stories mention an old keeper who never left the lighthouse. They say he tries to warn sailors of the rocks, even now. Most people think it's just an urban legend. But after what happened, I believe there might be some truth to it. For weeks, I had nightmares. I would dream that I was climbing those stairs again, hearing footsteps in front of me. In the dream, I could never reach the top. The steps felt endless, and my legs were heavy. Or I would dream that I reached the lantern room, and the figure turned around, showing a face hollowed out by age and salt. I would wake up in a sweat, heart pounding, unable to sleep again for hours. I decided to keep quiet about it in a professional setting. If I admitted I believed in a phantom light keeper, clients might avoid me. But I couldn't fully move on. I found myself drawn to old records about the lighthouse. I learned that it was shut down after a modern beacon was erected nearby. The old caretaker supposedly died on the job many years ago. Some said he refused to leave because he believed he was the only one protecting boats from the rocks. I haven't gone back to that cove. Every time I think about doing it, my hands get clammy, and I remember that feeling of fear coursing through me as I heard that machinery awaken. I remember the water lapping at my ankles and the panic that gripped me when I saw the tide. The memory sticks in my mind, especially the chill in the lantern room. I don't think it was just my imagination. It felt too real. Sometimes I catch myself scrolling through the photos from that morning. They're ordinary at first glance, but I know what happened. I still see that faint shape in the top window of one shot, like someone standing watch. People can say it's a trick of the light or a speck of dirt on the lens, but I remember hearing those footsteps. I remember seeing that arm pointing out to sea. I believe that keeper is still there, repeating his old duties, trying to warn travelers of the danger below. Even now, I feel an odd sense of respect for that place. I'm not eager to return, but I can't forget it either. I sometimes imagine the old keeper pacing near the lens, checking the rusted gears, attempting to fire them up. Part of me wonders what would have happened if I had stayed. Would I have seen the lantern glow for longer? Or would I have found myself trapped by the tide, stuck with that presence until morning? For now, I just avoid that stretch of coast. I don't mention it to new acquaintances. If the topic of lighthouses comes up, I change the subject. The experience left a mark on me that I can't explain away. I still shoot seascapes, but I do it with a fresh caution. I never let my curiosity draw me into old structures without a second thought. I don't try to push my luck with solitary ruins. I believe that keeper is tied to that tower. I believe he shows himself to warn people or to remind them of the coast's hidden hazards. Whatever the reason, I felt a presence I can't deny. The memory leaves me uneasy, but it also feels like a reminder. There are moments we can't fully understand, and sometimes it's best to walk away when we sense something beyond our grasp. For me, that old lighthouse will always be proof that some places never stop holding on to the past. Even if the light is long dead, the duty that once lived there continues in its own way. I felt it in the chill of that lantern room and in the sight of that figure pointing out across the water. No matter how long I live, I won't forget what I experienced in that place. It changed how I see the coastline, and it changed how I see the world around me. I still remember the first time I stepped foot on the trail leading to the old dam near Richmond. The place was called the Bell Dam by local folks, the Barragem dos Sinos, if I'm saying it correctly. I was there to study local fish populations for my biology project. I'd read about the dam in old records and knew it had some interesting historical features, like the metal bells people hung along the structure in the late 1800s. Many of the bells had fallen off into the water over time, but some remained. I arrived in late afternoon, hoping to finish my survey before dusk. The trail that led to the dam was lined with tall trees showing autumn colors. Yellow and orange leaves drifted across the path. It looked peaceful. I could hear the slow rush of water in the distance, a gentle trickle where the river had been partially diverted. I carried my sampling gear in a small backpack, a notebook, water test kits, and a simple net. The air felt slightly cool. I took deep breaths, enjoying the fresh scent of wet leaves and earth. After half an hour of walking, I reached a wooden sign marking the edge of the dam area. The sign was so worn that the lettering was barely visible. Behind it, I could see part of the old dam structure. It was a rough stone wall that blocked part of the river's flow, creating a calm pool on one side and letting water spill over on the other. My first impression was that it looked abandoned but strangely intact for its age. The faint sound of metal clanging caught my ear. I assumed it was just some loose part of the dam moving in the breeze. I stepped closer. As I approached, I noticed several metal frames sticking up from the dam's edge. Some held small bells. Others were empty hooks where bells had probably once hung. A couple of bells dangled precariously, and one large bell stood near the center, cracked down its side. The wind was mild, barely enough to stir the leaves, yet I heard occasional dull chimes. They sounded spaced out, like a random, uneven pattern. My pulse rose a bit, though I couldn't explain why. The area was nearly silent except for the water and those faint bell sounds. I tried to refocus on my task. I stepped onto a shallow, rocky patch near the water to collect some samples. The stones were slippery, so I moved slowly. The water felt chilly around my ankles. I knelt down, dipped my test tube, and grabbed a sample of the slow-moving water. The reflection of the sky rippled in front of me. Then I heard a soft clang behind me, louder than the breezes I'd noticed. It sounded like one of the bells being struck more forcefully. I jerked upright, nearly spilling the sample. My heart thumped in my chest. I stood still, listening. Another clang came, this time from a bell I could see on the far side of the dam, yet the wind hadn't picked up. I felt an unexpected sense of unease. The hair on my arms prickled. I glanced around but saw no one else. I told myself that the dam's old metal might be shifting or reacting to a slight breeze I couldn't feel. Still, I decided to finish my collection process quickly. I labeled a small container with the time and location, then walked along the stone ledge to gather one more sample in a slightly deeper spot. The water there looked dark, reflecting the shape of a broken bell lying on the bank. The air around me felt cooler, almost as if the sun had vanished behind a cloud. I checked the sky, only a few wispy clouds, nothing that should block out much light. Still, the place seemed dimmer. I stepped into the water again, ankles submerged, and scooped up the second sample. My skin felt a sudden chill, and I realized the water was far colder than just a moment ago. I tried to steady my nerves. I recapped the vial and placed it in my backpack. When I looked up, I thought I saw a faint figure on the other side of the dam, near a cluster of old stones. My chest tightened. I blinked, and the figure was gone. The trees rustled gently. I took a few steps to the side for a clearer view, but there was no one. Maybe it was a trick of the light. My body still felt tense. I decided I had enough samples for one day. I stepped back onto the dam walkway, which felt slippery in some sections. I looked at the largest bell in the center and saw a hairline fracture running from top to bottom. It must have been the big bell I'd read about in local folklore. People said it once rang on Sundays, or that it was used in ceremonies to bless the waters. I reached out and tapped it lightly with my knuckles. The tone it produced was deep and resonant, sending a slight vibration through my hand. It gave me a sudden jolt of unease, so I stepped back. A moment later, I heard soft murmurs, almost like a distant chant. I couldn't make out words. It sounded melodic, but also distorted by the wind or the water. My heartbeat sped up. I scanned the area again, my eyes jumping from one spot to another, searching for someone who might be singing or chanting. The clearing near the dam was empty. My breath caught in my throat. The chanting grew a bit louder, then faded, replaced by the sporadic clanging of the bells. I took a few shaky steps. My foot slipped on a patch of algae, and I nearly fell. The adrenaline rush forced me to move with more caution. My chest felt tight. I hurried off the dam, stepping back onto the main trail. My plan was to leave immediately. But a moment later, I paused because I wanted to check the old mill ruins nearby. The historical records mentioned them, and I thought it could be a good place to note any structural changes that might affect the water flow. I scolded myself for being too curious, but I turned toward the remains of the mill about 50 yards from the dam. The mill site was a jumble of collapsed stones, broken wooden beams, and rusted metal pieces. Some gears lay half buried in the ground, presumably used long ago to grind grain. In the center, a large bell sat on its side, cracked and partially covered in moss. I approached it carefully. The crack along the bell looked severe, large enough to fit 2 fingers inside. I felt a cold shiver pass over me. Then, without warning, the bell vibrated, producing a muted ring. It felt as if something inside was moving. I dropped to one knee and peered closer, seeing nothing but darkness in the gap. Then I heard a faint series of voices, like a distant choir. They had a rhythmic quality, almost chanting like before, but more melodic. My heart thumped. I stood up quickly, stepping away from the bell. The ground near the base of the bell shifted, and I stumbled backward, nearly losing my balance. My mind raced. Could it be an animal living under there, or was the wind caught inside the metal? My nerves were on edge. A wave of fear coursed through me, making my breath shallow. That's when the bells on the dam started clanging in unison. The ring carried across the water, echoing against the surrounding trees. Each clang felt like a pulse, steady and synchronized. My stomach tightened. I snapped my head around, fully expecting to see people striking the bells. But the dam was empty. The bells just swayed on their frames, clanking out a slow, haunting melody. The chanting continued in the background, blending with the ringing. My legs felt weak. I realized I was trembling. My immediate thought was to run. I turned toward the trail, forcing my feet to move. As soon as I got back to the main path, the clanging slowed. By the time I was 50 yards away, it reduced to occasional dull notes. The chanting faded, leaving only the rustle of leaves. I walked fast, almost jogging. My cheeks felt hot, and my throat was dry. Each step felt heavier, like I was escaping a place I never should have entered. I didn't dare look back. After another 15 minutes on the trail, I finally stopped to catch my breath. The forest sounded normal here. Birds calling, leaves shifting, no bells. My heart rate gradually slowed. I tried to rationalize what happened. Old metal, shifting wind, echoes in a narrow valley. It could all add up. But my gut told me it was more than that. The sequence of events, the chanting, the perfectly timed clanging, and the movement of those bells when there was barely any wind, it felt off. That night, I returned home and checked the water samples. They looked ordinary under my makeshift microscope. The pH levels, temperature readings, and other data seemed typical of a slow-moving river. I wrote up my preliminary notes for the project, but I couldn't get my mind off the strange sounds. My hands shook when I remembered the chanting and the way the bells rang without explanation. In the following weeks, I avoided returning to that spot alone. I did some online research, coming across local tales about the old Bell Dam. Some stories claimed that monks or devotees once used the bells for rituals to bless or ward off spirits in the water. Others said the bells were hung there to commemorate workers who drowned during dam construction, and their ghosts might roam the area. Nothing was certain, but the recurring theme was that these bells sometimes rang out at odd hours, even without wind. I told a close friend what happened, leaving out the part about hearing chanting. He laughed nervously, assuming I just spooked myself in an empty place. I didn't argue. I still felt uneasy discussing it, and I doubted anyone who hadn't been there would understand. Even now, I occasionally think about going back to get more samples, but my stomach knots at the idea. The memory of those bells ringing in sync, the odd vibration under the old mill bell, and that eerie chant sticks in my mind. My chest tightens every time I recall the sensation of being watched. I ended up finishing my biology project using the samples I collected, but I made no mention of what else I experienced. My official report stated the water was normal, with standard seasonal variations. I couldn't bring myself to explain the bizarre events near the dam. Whenever someone asks me about local research sites around Richmond, I hesitate before mentioning the Bell Dam. If they press for details, I keep it vague, saying it's an interesting historical spot, but a bit unstable for fieldwork. Sometimes I wonder if the bells still ring there on their own, or if a bigger storm has knocked them down by now. Either way, I feel a surge of relief knowing I'm not there to hear them. I can't shake the feeling that something remains by that dam, echoing through those old, cracked bells. When I think about the chanting, my hands get clammy and my heart rate jumps. I don't plan to return. I've seen enough to know that place holds an unsettling energy I can't explain and don't care to face again. My time there was enough to mark me with a lingering sense of dread whenever I recall the chiming of metal in still air. I remember that night in Chicago more vividly than I'd like. I was working a late shift for a local pizza place, and I thought I knew every alley in the downtown area. Normally, I stuck to the main streets, especially after dark, but I'd been running behind schedule, and the traffic was horrible. I decided to cut through a back alley I'd never used before. It was supposed to connect two major avenues. That seemed like a good idea at the time. I parked my scooter near the entrance to the alley, glanced at my phone's map, and saw that it should lead out a couple of blocks away. The alley looked typical enough at first glance: graffiti on brick walls, a couple of flickering overhead lights, and some trash piled in the corners. I could hear the hum of the city behind me, along with distant car horns. It felt a bit isolated, but not unusual for Chicago at that hour. The plan was to slip through, deliver the pizza on time, and head back. A few steps in, I noticed something off. Instead of continuing in a straight line, the alley seemed to split. There was a narrow cross path, forming what looked like a small four-way intersection. It was strange because I'd never heard of an alley that branched like that in this neighborhood. My phone's map hadn't indicated anything but a simple, single alley. Still, I assumed maybe it was an older section that never got properly documented. I turned left, figuring I could cut back right later. After maybe 3 minutes of walking, I realized I was back at a similar intersection, also with 4 possible directions. I paused and felt a slight sinking in my stomach. I double-checked my phone, but it showed that I was nearly out the other side. Yet the alley around me stretched on, with the same dingy lights and chipped bricks. I shrugged it off, tried another direction, and walked a couple more minutes. The alley was quiet, aside from a faint dripping noise from a broken pipe overhead. Then I found myself at another 4-way intersection, or possibly the same one. The same flickering bulb hung above, and the same graffiti tag was on the wall, a tall, distorted shape that resembled a face. I noticed my breathing was speeding up. My logic told me I must have gotten turned around, but I couldn't see how. The layout made no sense. I kept my phone in my hand, refreshing the map. The GPS marker flickered in place, as though it couldn't locate me precisely. The screen showed a normal grid of streets around me, not multiple intersections stacked one after another. I tried the direction that should lead me toward the building where I had to deliver the pizza, but after maybe 5 minutes, I returned to the same spot. I recognized a piece of torn advertisement on the ground next to a broken bottle. My nerves tightened. I felt a flush of heat in my face despite the cool night air. The overhead lamp made a faint buzzing noise. It flickered, casting odd shadows on the walls. Every path looked identical, with graffiti and battered bricks. My heart started thudding in my chest because I couldn't figure out how to get out. I thought about turning back the way I came, but that direction just led me to another identical intersection. It was as if the alley had more corners than should be physically possible. I began to suspect I was in some weird loop. I decided to stop and gather my thoughts. I set down the pizza bag for a moment, took a breath, and tried to calm down. The alley was silent, except for that dripping pipe. Then I heard footsteps, light and quick, somewhere behind me. I spun around and saw no one. The footsteps faded. My skin prickled. I shouted, "Hello?" but got no reply. The echo of my voice felt strangely flat. I picked up the pizza and walked faster in the direction I guessed might lead me out. My footsteps echoed against the brick, and I listened for any sign of another person, but everything went still. A few yards ahead, I spotted a larger graffiti piece, an enormous face with open eyes and a grim expression. It looked different from the one I'd passed before. I moved past it, turning another corner. A minute later, I came across a second, nearly identical face, but its eyes were closed. I rubbed my own eyes, trying to be sure I wasn't hallucinating. I heard a rasping whisper that sounded like someone saying, "Don't leave." It was low, barely audible. The effect was immediate. I felt a jolt of fear in my chest. I started to jog, ignoring any sense of direction. I just wanted to find a main street or any sign of normal city life. I passed more walls covered in tags and partial scribbles. My sense of direction completely failed. Every time I reached another intersection, the overhead bulb flickered, and I'd see the same battered trash can or the same random scrawl. My heart pounded, and my breath got shallow. I thought about turning back again, but there was no clear back anymore. I felt sweat on my forehead. I kept checking my phone, but the navigation refused to give me a route. My battery was draining fast. The pizza was definitely getting cold, but that was the least of my worries. At some point, I stumbled upon a slightly different corner. One of the walls had a metal door, slightly ajar. The only reason I even noticed it was because the overhead light was flickering more than usual in that spot. The door looked old, covered with chipped paint. I had no idea where it led, but I needed to break out of this repetitive alley. Without thinking too long, I yanked the door open and stepped through. My heart hammered as I faced a narrow stairwell. It smelled musty, like wet concrete. I took the steps two at a time, going up. The darkness made me grip the railing tightly. The sound of my own footsteps echoed, and the faint smell of something stale hung in the air. I climbed maybe 3 flights before I found another door at the top. Light seeped in around its frame. My chest felt tight, either from the climb or from my nerves. I pushed the door open, and it led me into an upper floor of some old building. The hallway was dim, but I saw a window at the far end. I headed for it, drawn by the glow of streetlights outside. When I reached the window and looked out, I saw a normal Chicago street below, busy with late-night traffic and people walking by. Relief washed over me so strongly that my knees almost gave out. I wasted no time. I hurried down the hall, found a set of interior stairs, and descended quickly. Each floor looked more normal than the next. Lights, scuffed tile floors, a faint smell of cleaning supplies. Eventually, I reached a lobby, stepped through a glass door, and found myself on the sidewalk of a main thoroughfare. Cars whizzed by, and people stood at a nearby bus stop. I could hardly believe it. I checked my phone. The screen now showed my location accurately. I was about 4 blocks from the address where I needed to deliver the pizza. The time was much later than I expected. I must have lost nearly half an hour in those alleys. The pizza was probably lukewarm at best, but I didn't care. I hopped on my scooter, which I'd parked at the alley entrance, except now it was right around the corner, as if the alley ended normally near that main street. There was no sign of the labyrinth I had just escaped. Feeling rattled, I delivered the pizza with a quick apology. The customer looked annoyed, but took it without question. After that night, I avoided any shortcuts involving alleys. The experience shook me up so much that I still get anxious if I see a poorly lit alleyway in the city. I told a few co-workers about it, but they just gave me odd looks. One friend suggested maybe I got turned around or hallucinated. But I know what I experienced. That place didn't behave like a normal city block. I can't explain it, but it felt like the space itself was twisted, looping me into the same spot again and again. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found that metal door. Would I have remained lost, circling the same intersections all night? There was no logical reason for a few random alleys to branch into 4 identical paths over and over. Yet that's exactly what I encountered. I've passed by that general area in broad daylight a couple of times since then, but I've never managed to locate the same alley. The roads look standard with no sign of those multiple intersections. I've heard rumors about hidden corners in big cities that don't show up on maps. Some people say it's leftover architecture from expansions or demolitions. Others talk about gaps in the grid that cause illusions. To me, it felt more deliberate, as though it existed to trap someone who wandered in. The memory still makes me break into a light sweat. I can recall the flickering lamps, the repeating graffiti, and that voice telling me not to leave. The thought gives me chills. I moved on from that pizza job a while later, mostly due to normal career changes, but also because I couldn't shake the memory of that night. Even now, if I have to deliver or pick up something downtown, I stay on well-lit streets. I'll drive an extra mile or two just to avoid stepping into any secluded alley. The possibility of running into that bizarre labyrinth again makes my stomach knot. I don't have a rational explanation, but I know I never want to experience that sense of disorientation and dread again. If anyone ever mentions a four-corner alley in Chicago, I warn them to steer clear. I doubt they believe me, but at least I've done my part to keep them safe. I learned the hard way that some shortcuts are not worth the risk, especially in a city that can hide places you might never escape on your own.